As Edgar floated alongside him, Jonathan started to make decent headway upon his next rank up within his mana manipulation pathway skill. They walked for hours, and as the city started to come into view, Jonathan had made some good progress in increasing the level of his skill. Edgar had not been idle either, and had been working on his elemental mastery. When he touched down, he did so with a bit more aplomb than usual. "Are you sure this won't cause friction with the Uthraki allies that we have? I doubt that they will take kindly to us killing their people," he said as he landed. "Well, the Uthraki are hardly a monolithic block of a race. It's not like they are some sort of hive mind that follow the directions of a single overlord." "I suppose so. Then again they would hardly find out, would they? Their civilization is one of brutality and coarse honor. A fair fight is like an effort of worship to them." As Jonathan spoke, he took in the sight of the city in front of him. It was built almost entirely out of obsidian, which had the effect of making it look like it was a shadow upon the realm, rather than an actual city. It was huge, easily twice the size of his own city, if not more. Compared to the Ashen Citadel, however, it was quite small. Patrols of armored guards walked around on the city ramparts, and a massive metal gate stood guard at the front of the city. The land around the city was quite empty, however, cleared of all possible hiding spots. The city would have looked a lot more impressive had its material been more varied, but as it was quite hard to make out the details. It just looked like some god had crafted what they thought a city would look like, made entirely out of shadow. The low natural light of the realm was not helping either. Only the red skin of the Uthraki allowed Jonathan to make them out as they strode across the battlements. In this world, there was no effort made to cultivate food, given that everyone was tier 2. As a result, the cities and settlements tended to be far starker than they would have been in the ash heaps. Jonathan suspected that there were ways that people could eat at higher ranks and still benefit from it. "Somebody is taking inspiration from C-list supervillains," Jonathan muttered under his breath. "What?" Edgar asked. "Never mind. It's a reference to something that I can't really explain," Jonathan replied. Edgar frowned, but let it go. Sometimes, the sensitive hearing of system-enhanced individuals could be annoying. Jonathan would get around to telling Edgar about Earth eventually, but not now that he did not want to risk bringing the wrath of some being more powerful than him down on himself. Who knew what happened to outsiders in this universe? It was likely that they were reviled, and hunted down with extreme prejudice. After all, he had never seen another one. As the two men watched the citadel in front of them, the ground started to shake. A monster was approaching, one that was enormous. A moment later, a massive reptilian creature, one that looked like a sort of oversized T-Rex, came charging towards the city. The creature was at least 75 feet tall, and covered with spikes. Its skin was made up of smooth scales, and in the center of each scale was a foot-long spine that looked like it could pierce through metal and stone. Each stride shook the earth as it moved, and a faint aura of power could be felt around it. As the monster neared, the aura grew stronger, creating a solid force that pressed down on Edgar and Jonathan. Neither man tried to resist, fearful of bringing the wrath of the monster down on them. In an exposed place like this, fighting the creature would alert the city guards to their presence. As the monster raced by, Jonathan and Edgar watched, holding their breaths. The obsidian walls of the citadel started to change and shift as some of the Uthraki used their elemental abilities on them. The walls rose higher and higher, and large spikes of rock were forced out of the substrate. The Uthraki began to launch the rock spikes at the invader, eliciting roars of anger and pain from the beast. However, the spikes were not enough, and the creature continued towards the city. By the time it was within 100 feet, a platoon of Uthraki were waiting for it on the wall. They jumped off in unison, brandishing a motley assortment of weapons. As the T-Rex started to claw at the walls, the crew of highly trained Uthraki went to town on its legs, drawing blood with each strike. Annoyed by the gnats circling it, the monster began to stomp, trying to catch its tormentors with its massive feet. However, the Uthraki were quite high level, and avoided it with consummate skill, using the openings to continue attacking. From the wall, supporting fire rained down, peppering the creature with bolts of energy and more mundane projectiles besides. Because there was no wood in their realm, all of the siege weaponry was made out of metal, rock and sinew. The ballistas fired long spikes of bone that punched through the sound barrier. The draw weight on the weapons were so high that they propelled their loads like cannons. The projectiles streaked down, slamming into the monster like the vengeance of an angry demigod. It roared in pain, louder this time, and thrashed against the wall, trying to bring it down. Ominous cracks rang out as it did so, but the wall was simply reformed by the magic of the Uthraki as the damage was dealt. Soon the monster had been worn down by the combined assault, and collapsed, bloodied and broken, to the ground. There, it was quickly executed by the squad of Uthraki. "Damn! That was impressive," Jonathan said. "Are you sure attacking here is wise?" Edgar replied, looking apprehensive. After all, the defenders here were all a cut above the average ones of this realm. However, they needed a bit of danger to spice up their leveling speed. The monsters were too few and far between to be as effective in providing essence, and a lot more unpredictable. If they got into the city, they could wear down the Uthraki numbers as they went, gaining levels in the process. Even more importantly, there were probably valuable weapons and armor located within the city. As the men sat there, watching the platoon of Uthraki re-enter the city, Jonathan waited for a moment of opportunity. As the ground crunched under the steel-clad boots of the Uthraki, he spotted one. As the ballistas and siege weapons were being reloaded, there was a brief window of time where nobody was looking at the ground. Before Edgar could say anything, Jonathan grabbed him, and charged. He pumped his stamina into his legs, sending himself and Edgar flying forwards at thousands of miles per hour. They reached the walls in the blink of an eye, where they quickly pressed up against them, invisible to the guards watching above. Edgar opened his mouth as if to say something, but Jonathan shook his head. There was no reason to risk everything at this point. The guards likely had highly advanced senses, and would be able to hear every word that they were saying, unless they spoke at a level below a whisper. Jonathan waited for a few minutes, before he heard the gates of the city slamming shut. It was time to make their move. He mimed rising up into the air to Edgar, and the man quickly formed a cocoon of wind around them, lifting them up towards the sky. He did so at a slow but purposeful rate, giving them time to react to any possible dangers. They kept below the shadow of the battlements, making sure that nobody would be able to see them. As they moved, Jonathan looked over the wall, interested in the substance that it was made of. The wall was almost completely smooth, and likely quite a bit more durable than it looked. Many materials in this realm were tier 2 after all, and he doubted that the wall of the city was made out of anything lesser. It was an impressive edifice, and one that seemed to have stood the test of time adequately. After all, in a world like this, a monster was far more likely to end your life than anything else. Jonathan waited until they were approaching the top of the wall to make his move. He started to channel his elemental energy in preparation to strike, in case there were any enemies waiting for them. However, when they rose up and over the edge of the wall, they were in a natural blind spot between two ballistas. The space between them was small, but it was out of sight. The Uthraki nearby were too focused on their work to be on the lookout for invaders. After all, who would be stupid enough to do such a thing? The Uthraki did not seem to have wars as far as Jonathan could tell, and he doubted that everyone in the world already knew of his existence. No, he was safe enough for now. Edgar sent a probe of wind forwards to scout out the area, and when it returned, he nodded at Jonathan. With quick, purposeful steps they made their way to the edge of the wall, and hopped down into the city. They fell for a few seconds before landing next to a large building, one that seemed like some sort of collective domicile. It was filled with a steady hubbub, and people came in and out around the corner. The two men quickly slunk towards a nearby alleyway, wanting to get a better idea about the city before they did anything risky. "Did you hear that the hunting grounds are discharging more monsters?" in greater quantities? Perhaps it is time for another testing, a nearby Uthraki said to her companion, as they walked down the street. The other one simply nodded. Don't you understand what this means? A steady invasion of high-leveled monsters. The elders might have to come out in force for the first time in years. Look, Markle, I don't have time for your harebrained conjectures. If the gods will it, then it will happen. There is nothing that we can do about it. The conversation faded. Out of earshot by that point, seeing as the Uthraki moved rather quickly, leaving Jonathan with a lot of valuable information. Apparently, the monsters of this realm came from a specific spot, likely where they were respawned by the system after their deaths. He wondered where the Uthraki respawned. When they came back, were they the same people as before? He doubted it. That information would be useful for later, in case he ever wanted to farm some levels. Of course, the strength of the creatures in that area would likely be astronomically higher than he would easily be able to deal with, at least for now. For now, he had this city to provide him with levels. Killing a few Uthraki would do wonders for his level, especially ones as high level as this. The old Jonathan would have been apprehensive about this, but now that he knew that the Uthraki would simply be reborn, and would probably kill him themselves if they saw him, the moral qualms were gone. The two men headed further into the alleyway, getting out of the view of the main road. All right. How are we going to deal with this? Edgar asked. Jonathan had begun to notice that his companion liked for others to make plans. Perhaps it was part of his politician pathway skill. After all, one could not be blamed if another made the plan. Realizing that Edgar was looking at him expectantly, Jonathan nodded. Well, the main reason we came here is for essence. If we kill off a few Uthraki, we can easily gain levels. Also, this city probably has some sort of treasury. We can bolster our wealth as well as our levels. How do we ensure that there are no witnesses? Edgar replied. Well, if any of these Uthraki see us, they will rush to kill us. If we return the favor before they can do so, then we will be able to fight back. It will prevent any witnesses naturally. I doubt the Uthraki are the sort to flee from battle. Likely this mentality will lead to their own deaths at our hands. Edgar simply nodded in response, and the two men started on their path deeper into the city, eager to gain some well-deserved levels. The alleyways of the city were mostly empty, as the Uthraki preferred walking out in the open. As they observed the behaviors of the citizens, Jonathan was able to get a better idea of their culture. It seemed that regular duels were a large part of their civil code, and he witnessed people fighting for the smallest of things. The duels almost always ended in bloodshed. He had seen multiple Uthraki, bathed in blood, standing over the battered corpses of their enemies. At least it helped to assuage his guilt about his plans to kill more of them. It was an interesting way to treat discontent. If the citizens dealt with it, then it was easier all around. However, it was also prone to meaningless death. There were easily tens of thousands of Uthraki in the city, but it was a lot smaller than a similar city would have been back on Earth, given that there was no space given to food production and distribution. As a result, the city was probably half the size that it should have been. Most of the buildings were uniform in shape, and the few shops that existed seemed to be made for the purpose of selling weapons or other martial goods. In a civilization where battle was the pinnacle of existence, there was little room for anything else. The people here seemed to be a step above the normal Uthraki, and were certainly wealthier and stronger than the normal ones. Each of them seemed to be near Husher or Tucker's strength, but they likely possessed less mastery over their skills. They were similar in level, but not in experience. Most of them seemed to simply be civilians with a bit of combat experience, something common within this realm. After all, when you lived in a place like Tartarus, everything was out to kill you. A degree of personal strength was always necessary. Jonathan and Edgar headed deeper into the city. They needed a place to rest and recuperate when they were not fighting. Because of the strength of the citizens of the city, it would be the height of foolishness to remain in the open after having killed some of the citizens. They would need to be able to retreat to somewhere safe at will. The various back alleyways of the city were good for hiding in, but they were still not exactly the most secure places. Anyone could walk into them, and they acted like a funnel that prevented escape. Jonathan would have given a limb for the earth manipulation ability that the Uthraki had, which would have made this so much easier. However, he had other abilities. The walls of the buildings around him were curiously thick, and seemed to have a lot of space between them and the interior of the building. "How thick do you think those are?" he asked Edgar, pointing at a nearby wall. The other man sent out a tendril of wind into a crack, pursing his lips in concentration. "About 7 feet thick." "Why?" "We can carve out a hiding spot in the walls, if we are clever with utilizing the space," Jonathan replied. "Ah. Clever. Well, how are we to hide the entrance? None of us have any sort of creation abilities." Jonathan simply winked, and headed towards the walls. He only realized a few moments later that Edgar would have been unable to see the wink through his helmet. With a grunt, he began to summon his void mana to his hands, creating rotating balls of purple light. Moving over to a section of the wall bathed in shadow, he started to etch away at it with his abilities. As soon as he had made a human-sized hole in the wall, he stepped inside, and started to widen the hole, extending it outwards in every direction. Because of the dark color of the obsidian, it did a good job of blending in with the shadows that surrounded it, hiding the entranceway from view. He extended it for 12 feet in both directions, creating a shaft along the side of the wall that he could retreat down. It was easily long enough to hide both men from sight. He exited the hole a moment later, flashing Edgar a thumbs-up sign. The other man smiled, and used his wind abilities to clear the dust out of the hole. "Good. I think it's time to get to know the city a bit better," Edgar said. "Know your enemy, and all that." Jonathan frowned at him. "Where did you hear that saying?" "Why?" It was one of the various pieces of wisdom that nobles were indoctrinated with as children. "From the work of some great general." Jonathan frowned at this. This was yet another commonality between Earth and Telvaria that he was noticing. For there to be the exact same quote, from a man who seemed very similar to Sun Tzu, was more than a coincidence. It was almost like some divine being had grown lazy, and was throwing universes into the cosmic photocopier. Many scientists back on Earth would have given almost anything to have proof of other universes, and here Jonathan was. Then again, none of them would last especially long in Telvaria. It was a very dangerous place. Without paying the saying any more heed, Jonathan simply signaled to Edgar for quiet, and began to head down the alleyway. What they were about to do was hardly the most honorable of things, but it was efficient. The alleyways led into the center of the city, which was where most of the action was going down. Before either man started a killing spree, they wanted to know what they were dealing with in terms of average strength. The alleyway twisted and turned through the forest of dark rock, before depositing them outside the centermost building in the city. There seemed to be something of a public address going on as they arrived, being delivered by a truly massive Uthraki warrior. He stood in front of a monolithic edifice that looked more like a Baroque castle than a city hall. Word has come from the ancestral lands that the monster waves are growing larger. This has not happened since the days of Granath. The gods are testing us, and we must respond. Already, hordes of vile beasts have made their way past the cordons around the hunting grounds, and are heading our way. Every Uthraki must fight to protect our lands. A cheer rose up from the crowd as they started to pump their armaments up and down. As they postured, Jonathan fired off his channeled basic true sight skill at the leader. Mortan Aligar. Level 187. Health, 18790/18790. Status, healthy. The man's level was worryingly high, as well as his health. However, 18,000 was not as much as it seemed. If Jonathan had focused on his constitution over his strength, he would have had over 20,000 points of health now. This likely meant that the Uthraki had focused his efforts on other avenues of power. Judging by his bulging muscles and his massive weapon, he had focused it on strength. Jonathan nodded, and started to slink back into the alleyway, followed by Edgar. There was no reason for them to draw attention to themselves now. As they headed into the dark and shadowy side road, Edgar spoke. "Are you sure we aren't biting off more than we can chew here?" That man's aura was intense. Jonathan had barely noticed the aura, to tell the truth, but he simply nodded. Danger equals more power gain. Granath is waiting for us, and the more time we spend leveling up, the more time he has to prepare. That monster will absolutely crush us if we do not rise to the occasion. You will have to deal with his strongest allies as well. I cannot focus on a being like Granath and other high-leveled ones as well. With centuries of time to consolidate their power, I guarantee that the true upper echelon of this world will be a cut above what we have faced before, he replied, looking back at Edgar. I suppose you're right. If we can't deal with a few Uthraki, then how could we deal with something like Granath? Right on, Jonathan said, smiling. They made their way back towards the hole in the wall, and headed inside. Their plan for now was to lie in wait, and spring out whenever one of the Uthraki passed by. The interior of the hole was dark, and would be impossible to see inside from the outside. However, Edgar also created a partition of wind to stop any foreign scents or sounds from drifting out of the room. Otherwise, they would have alerted any passers-by to their presence. With the enhanced senses of Tier 2s, any of the Uthraki would have noticed that something was amiss as soon as they passed by the hiding place. As Jonathan sat there, he began to channel his mana in and out, trying to get in some practice time before he had to fight. The glowing blue energy cycled smoothly in and out of his core, up and down his arms and feet, and all around his body. The caustic energy of the void should have killed him, but he was immune because of his true affinity. That made him wonder whether those with true affinities were completely immune to their own element. Would a fire mage with such an ability be completely inured against the heat of their element? However, it was balanced out by the fact that one was unable to have more than one affinity at a time. As well as that, having one made you weak against certain elements. That same fire mage would be far more affected by water than if they did not possess the affinity, even if their stats should have been high enough to stop such an effect. However, Jonathan assumed that water would become harmful to those with such a degree of power in their chosen element. It was good for them that beyond Tier 2, there was no need to drink. That would serve to protect them against the power of their opposing element. Jonathan meditated on the concepts of the elements more as he cycled his mana, thinking about how they worked. Each of the 12 elements was paired, with the void serving as the counterpart to all of them. Creation, mirrored by destruction. Fire was paired with water, earth with air, life with death, dark with light, time with fate, and order with chaos. All of them, except for time and fate, were self-evidently opposites. Jonathan was not exactly sure how those two elements opposed one another. They seemed to have similar purposes. Time made sure that the universe kept working, moving forwards into eternity, and fate kept that movement in a straight line. Perhaps it was to do with the fact that fate constrained time to some degree. In any case, it hardly mattered, given that he did not cultivate those elements. As he waited, he finally heard footsteps coming down the alleyway. Jonathan gave Edgar a pointed look, and started to summon his mana to his hands, keeping it locked within his skin so as to not create any light. As the footsteps neared, a tendril of wind snuck out of the hole, and whipped out at something. There was a muffled curse, and the noise of a body hitting the ground. Edgar and Jonathan exited, to see a burly Uthraki, covered in blood, lying on the ground. The blood was clearly not his own, and going by the necklace of severed ears around his neck, probably from multiple people as well. As soon as he saw Edgar and Jonathan, red light began to billow around him, signaling the use of some sort of skill. His claws lengthened, and his stance lowered until he looked like some sort of primal beast. There was no hesitation in his eyes as he leaped at his two assailants. Jonathan stepped backwards, and then drove his fist into the underside of the man's jaw, sending shockwaves through his skull. The Uthraki was knocked off his course, sent flying up into the air. As he fell, Edgar sent a spear of wind towards his abdomen. The man parried the strike with a shield of rock, summoned out of thin air. However, that left him open to Jonathan. Jonathan leaped over the charging brute, and came down with a thunderous elbow bomb, smashing the Uthraki into the ground. The tough obsidian of the streets barely shifted, given its immense durability. Edgar sent whips of energy towards his enemy, lifting the man up into the air. However, the Uthraki quickly broke the chains of wind, landing in front of them. He let out a wordless howl of rage, and all of a sudden, the necklace of ears began to shrivel up. Power raced out of them and into his body. It seemed like they had not just been some macabre decoration after all. The man bulked up even more, his skin starting to turn gray. Jonathan raced in, ducking under one blow, but taking another to the chest. The powerful kick sent him hurtling backwards into the wall. The air left his body, and he let out a pained grunt. The Uthraki roared in anger, and bounded forwards on all fours, assuming a more bestial air. Edgar summoned a shield of wind to protect himself, but as the Uthraki approached, the shield began to falter in the face of the red lights surrounding him. Edgar gritted his teeth and pumped more of his elemental energy into the skill, reinforcing it. A thunderous punch came hurtling in, slamming into the shield with the force of a house-sized hammer. The shield trembled, and Edgar took a step backwards. The Uthraki grinned through blood-stained teeth, and punched again, shaking the shield once more. In this form, the man was easily as strong as Jonathan was. However, this was some sort of transformation ability, and was not the Uthraki's true form. In his base, he was weaker than Jonathan. As the Uthraki beat Edgar into the ground, Jonathan pushed off the wall, and landed softly. He ran forwards, curling his fists, and threw himself at his enemy, coating his right hand with as much energy as he could muster. He drew upon all of his knowledge, creating a perfectly timed punch that caught the Uthraki just as he leaned back to prepare another blow. The punch sailed straight into the base of the man's chin, sending a resounding crack across the alleyway. Jonathan followed up the blow as the Uthraki stumbled backwards, snapping his neck with the punch. The demonic man fell over backwards, paralyzed. With a single devastating punch, Jonathan blasted the Uthraki's head apart with a concussive shock wave of force, painting the previously midnight black obsidian red with the viscera. Essence rushed into him, propelling him up a level. That had been a hard fight, but one that was ultimately worth it. Now that he had seen the true colors of the Uthraki, he had no qualms about killing them. Unlike Husher or Tucker, or the siblings, it seemed that many of the normal Uthraki were nothing more than savage brutes. Perhaps those in power did not need to constantly fight to prove themselves. They were undoubtedly the strongest, which prevented a lot of violence. In any case, Jonathan was not going to complain about levels. He was nothing if not pragmatic. The two men tidied up the blood, Edgar using his wind abilities to scoop it up and deposit it in a shadowy corner of the alleyway. As they entered their hiding place once more, Jonathan sighed. This feels, well, wrong in a sense. I know we need these levels, but the trappings of civilization around us make me compare these Uthraki to citizens of my own city. Jonathan held up a hand as Edgar started to say something. Yes, I know that is stupid. This race only cares about violence. If that Uthraki had seen us first, he would have raced to kill us. I'm not advocating for us to stop. All I am wondering is if there is a different way. The first few years of killing are always the hardest. I still remember my very first. I was called upon to execute a bandit who had been found guilty by the local authorities. He was set to die anyway, but my father decided that it would be useful to teach me a valuable life lesson. For the few days afterwards, I was a wreck. I refused to eat, and almost ran away. However, I soon came to the realization that the only constant in Telvaria is death. It will come eventually, no matter at whose hands. That sounds rough. How old were you at the time? Jonathan asked. I was 12. Jonathan simply took this in silence. He knew that his earthling sensibilities were tainting his judgment here, but he still was appalled. Although levels would have made up for lapses in judgment caused by youth, it still did nothing for the emotional aspect of being at that age. It would have been a terrible experience, no matter what. He would have loved to have a few stern words with Edgar's father. At his current level of power, he would have a chance of beating him. In fact, most tier 2s were within his range. Unless Edgar's father was at the very peak, Jonathan would have been able to pound him into a sack of jelly. As you can see, that was probably a good indication of the character of my father. All he cared about was preparing me for the throne. However, that never happened. My brother is probably getting ready soon. My father was quite old when I left. I never really knew my parents when I grew up. They both died pretty early on. However, at least my memories of them were not tainted by the heinous things that your father made you do. I have that to be thankful for. They sat there in silence for the next few hours, practicing with their skills. Jonathan was attempting to claim a new rune, but he could feel the construct slipping out of his mind as he tried. The fundamental building blocks of the system were not something that were conducive to everyday use. He could only hold a certain number within his mind at a time, likely controlled by his mastery over the skill. Still, looking into his runes gave him some valuable experience with both of his skills. However, it was nowhere near enough to get another rank. From journeyman on was a struggle that would be measured in months or even years. It was on a scale meant for those who lived forever, as long as they kept leveling. As such, it took far longer than any mortal could ever hope to live to reach the end. Jonathan would achieve true mastery. However, no matter how long it took. The next Uthraki came down the alleyway a few moments later, but this one seemed to be quite different from the first. It was clearly a woman, going by the shape of her body, but she was clad in a dark cloak that hid much of her features. She held a message in one hand, and a dagger in the other. This was not an everyday run-of-the-mill Uthraki. Jonathan gave Edgar a look, but the man simply shrugged. They leaped out at the passerby as she neared the entrance, stopping in front of her. The woman hissed and sank into a fighting stance, tucking the piece of paper away. Another knife appeared in her free hand. "Who are you?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. Then a look of shock came across her features, only visible on the lower half of her face. "Wait, you are not Uthraki. You must be outsiders." The Uthraki started to turn and flee, but Edgar tripped her up with a whip of wind, sending the woman sprawling. She seemed to be lower level than the first Uthraki had been. The letter spilled out onto the ground, and Jonathan hurriedly picked it up. Opening it, he read the contents. To the Guildmaster. Overlord Mortan Aligar has begun to crack down upon our people, sending his enforcers against them. However, there is little we can do about it. He is surrounded by a cabal of high-leveled fighters, and his home is warded against us. No Uthraki who is not aligned with him can enter. I hardly need to expound on the difficulty of killing him in public. We need a change of plan, before our heads line the walls of this city. Nightblade number 7. Jonathan rolled up the paper, and looked down at the Uthraki, who strangely enough, did not seem to be willing to flee. "Why do you not run?" Jonathan asked, curious. "I have already failed in my mission. You found my message, therefore I am compromised. I am ready for death." Jonathan did not move. Killing an enemy was one thing, but killing someone who was defenseless did not sit well with him. What was all this about killing the city lord? Jonathan asked, waving the piece of paper. "That man has oppressed us for the last few years. His doctrines grow even stricter, and his control over the city ever stronger. He is a tyrant, who rules not through his own strength, but through the strength of his allies. He has backing from the council of this realm, the three most powerful Uthraki in the world. Because of this, he has access to wardings and artifacts that render killing him nearly impossible. Right. The letter mentioned that no Uthraki could enter his house. What about a non-Uthraki? Yes, but getting a beast to enter the city would be impossible. It would be slain by the guards long before it reached. Wait, you're not suggesting what I think you are you? The woman said. We came to this city to kill and level up. It doesn't matter who we do it to. Besides, such a powerful man would provide a surplus of levels. Hope seemed to blossom in the woman's eyes as she took this in. She got to her feet, and hesitantly looked at Jonathan. You will have to come with me to the headquarters then. Our guildmaster will want to meet with you. She started walking away from them, in the same direction that she had been going originally. Jonathan and Edgar followed after her, getting ready to fight if this turned out to be a trap of some kind. She led them through the alleyway and out into a street, crossing a moment later. They entered another alleyway, and they soon found themselves before a nondescript door. The woman knocked on it in a curious pattern, and a small slit opened a moment later. An eye came into view, and then the door opened. A small Uthraki stood there, one so short for his race that Jonathan assumed he was genetically stunted in some way. He eyed up the newcomers, but then backed away, letting them in. There was a small chamber behind the door, one that looked like it was made for storing things in. Rusty armor and weapons were propped up against the walls. However, the stunted Uthraki pulled at a halberd, and the far wall opened up, revealing a spacious meeting hall. Dozens of Uthraki were in there, some of them sparring in designated arena spaces. In the very center, a few high-leveled Uthraki pored over a series of documents. The room was lit by a series of floating balls of light, which caused the obsidian of the room to sparkle. Support columns were visible all around the chamber. A staircase led down into the center of the building, which the Uthraki woman took. Edgar and Jonathan followed. If this was a trap, they would be in serious trouble. However, Jonathan was confident that he could escape if it came to it. Smite would allow him to temporarily send his strength through the roof, especially with the upgraded form. It had caught up to his level now, and provided similar boosts to when he had first come to this world. With it active, he would be able to fight on an equal level against most threats at his tier, save Granath, or anyone who had cultivated their potential to a similar degree. Jonathan was only as strong as he was because of his titles and his class choices. He was the product of destiny, and his power was far beyond the hopes of any to defeat. With all of his strength, he could probably take an average low tier 3 in combat now. However, that was simply conjecture. He would not be willing to test that. As they walked into the room, all of the Uthraki looked up from their tasks, studying the newcomers. All of them seemed to be experienced in the art of killing, and many had the dead-eyed look that came with career criminals. These were people who had lived under the gaze of the law for most of their lives, waiting for a chance to kill, steal, and seize what they wanted. Some of them looked at the two men with a greedy expression, as if they were hungry to find out just what they were. After all, Edgar and Jonathan were clearly not from this realm. They were almost 4 feet shorter than the Uthraki for the most part, and were a lot smaller in other metrics as well. Ignoring the gazes, Jonathan strode towards the center of the room, where the leader stood. The female Uthraki that had led them here scurried ahead, prostrating herself in front of the man. He was old for an Uthraki, and had a visible beard, something that Jonathan had never seen on a member of that race before. Guildmaster, I beg your pardon for bringing outsiders into our hold. However, they seem to possess the strength to help us. The man simply stared at the woman, and then, without warning, slapped her across the face so hard that she was lifted off her feet and sent flying into the air. Nobody reacted, as if this was a common occurrence. The scariest thing was that the man's expression did not change at all as he did it. He took a few steps towards Edgar and Jonathan, eyeing them up critically. You are both weak, in body and mind. Your level is paltry, and your auras are undirected. How in the world did one of my Nightblades find you worthy of helping us? It seemed that the man had decided to underestimate them straight off the bat. Both of the men had their auras retracted so as to not alert any passers-by in the alleyway to their presence, and they possessed strength beyond their level. The man's eyes flashed with reddish light, and a mountain of an aura fell down onto their shoulders, filled with the power of earth, mixed with the implacable will of a man who had grown old in a world as dangerous as this. However, compared to Granath's aura, it was nothing. Jonathan crossed his arms, and extended his own aura to its fullest, pushing the aura backwards. The Guildmaster's eyes widened as the swirling dome of purple light pushed his own aura back, enveloping the room. Because of his different power sets, Jonathan was very adept at using his aura. It was imbued with all of the things that made him so powerful, from his titles to his divinity. As a result, the aura of a man only a few dozen levels his senior could not compare. Eventually, the Guildmaster retracted his aura, seeming shaken. You are not what I expected. Perhaps we do have a shot at this after all. I am Guildmaster Zacharios, leader of this city's Thieves' Guild. Here however, we have a more open line of work. The city lord is a blustering tyrant, who we are trying to remove. However, as you might be able to tell, we have had little success with that. I know. We are willing to help, if you can make it worth our while, Edgar replied. They would have taken it anyway, simply for the essence opportunities, but it would be better to get something else out of it. We can offer you a wealth of riches if you so desire, straight out of our treasury, and out of the treasury of the city. Will that suffice? Depends. I believe it is time for a little bit of negotiation, Edgar replied. He sat down at a nearby table, and the Guildmaster did the same. What Jonathan witnessed next was akin to a massacre. With his politician skill, Edgar was far more adept than Zacharios at this sort of thing. Over the next half hour, he slowly whittled the Uthrakis will down to a nub, and then broke it. By the end, he had managed to gain a king's ransom in terms of value. As the agreement was finalized, he was met with a quest notification. You have gained a new quest. Wolf among the lambs, eh? You are a being far more cunning and vicious than any of the Uthraki, despite their higher level. None of them have achieved the things that you have. Despite this, they still underestimate you. In exchange for killing the ruler of this city, the local Thieves' Guild has offered you an embarrassment of riches in return, not realizing that you could wipe them out if you truly went all out. Rewards: 1 ton of Tier 2 iron, 3 natural treasures of your choice, and pick of 1 item from the city treasury. Accept? Y/N. In any case, the rewards were more than enough to satisfy him. It would be enough or to make him rich in terms of Leviathan marks, once he got it through the trading hub. In addition, the natural treasures were enticing as well. He suspected that the treasures from a world so focused on martial strength would be perfect for his path. Finally, there was the single item from the treasury. He had no idea what he would end up picking, but he would probably choose something that would be useful for his faction as a whole. He quickly accepted the quest, and rubbed his hands together. The Guildmaster looked mildly despondent as Edgar flounced over towards Jonathan, smirking widely. Well, I believe it is time that you shared your plan with us, Jonathan called out. Yes, Zacharios said, seeming a little bit distracted by his experience a few moments ago. As the letter that you read said, the compound that the ruler of this city lives in is warded against Uthraki. However, we believe that you too will be able to enter. Once there, you will need to turn off the warding, which should be easy enough. All you have to do is to smash the large crystal standing in the hallway. It should be visible from the outside. It's almost as if we are being taunted. Then what? Edgar pressured. Then you two will head into the building and distract the guards until we can enter. Afterwards, our combined might will come crashing down on the head of the tyrant, freeing this city once and for all. I assume that you desire to take the throne for yourself? Edgar asked, raising one eyebrow. Sicarios nodded instantly, without any sort of shame. Strength begets strength, and you too are being paid richly. Very well, Jonathan replied. When does this start? Now. We have been waiting for this moment for the better part of a year. As soon as the man said this, the other Uthraki began to prepare, grabbing weapons and armor from racks on the side of the building. They started to line up in the center of the room, their faces placid. A few mages began to cast buffing spells on the group, some of which affected Jonathan as well. He felt his durability increasing, as well as his strength. The boosts were small, compared to his level, but were still welcome. Unlike Edgar's buffing skill, these ones were diluted in strength so that they could target multiple people at once. As soon as the buffs were applied, Jonathan and Edgar raced up towards the door. They needed to hurry up. They exited a moment later, and ran down the street, heading towards the center of the city. Even from here, the castle-like building that the city lord dwelled in was visible. As they made their way down the street, they kept their heads down, not wanting to draw attention. The presence of guards amped up the closer they got to the center of the city, and they were soon being forced to take side roads and hop over buildings to get there unseen. They reached the city center a few minutes later, pausing on the top of a building. Now that the public address was over, the crowd was gone, revealing the warded entrance to the building. A faint purple shimmer coated the entire palace, and the glow was brightest around the doorway. As they had been told, a large opalescent crystal could be seen in the center of the hallway, the source of the light. As they watched, Jonathan saw a few guards troop in and out, unconcerned by the aura surrounding the building. It looked like certain people could be made exempt from the restriction. As the guards rounded the corner, Jonathan leaped down, landing like a cat. His dexterity, which was approaching the second threshold, was at such a level that he could make a landing in full armor and make barely any noise at all. Meanwhile, Edgar simply floated down. With a quick hand signal at Edgar, Jonathan raced forwards, towards the entrance. He flitted from side to side, using his stamina abilities to conceal his motion. To all but the most powerful of Tier 2s, he would have been a blur. By the time he reached the entrance, he was ready for a fight. He simply stepped through the light, and into the hallway. A group of guards staggered to their feet, from where they had been having a presumably illicit drinking game. It seemed that even in a city where food and drink were almost non-existent, alcohol still served a purpose. However, the guards were too slow for Jonathan. He tensed his legs and sent his stamina to them, before flashing forwards like a streak of light. He smashed through the bodies of his foes, each hand splattering the Uthraki, sending detonations of void light through their bodies. He turned around a moment later and brought his fist down on the crystal. The crystal shattered with a light tinkling noise, and the purple shield dissipated into motes of light. A titanic roar of rage rose up from the center of the castle, no doubt from the city lord. Jonathan and Edgar kept moving, hearing the noises of footsteps behind them as the members of the guild trooped on in. It seemed that they either had some sort of obfuscation ability, or a teleportation one, as Jonathan had not seen or heard them until this moment. Guards started to file out into the hallway, forming up in front of Jonathan and Edgar. Edgar simply snapped his fingers, and the guards were unbalanced by waves of wind. These basic guards were weaker than even the Uthraki with the ear necklace had been, which was strange. Perhaps he had simply been off shift or something, as Jonathan doubted a being that strong would simply be allowed to live unaffiliated in the city. These Uthraki were over level 160, but compared to Jonathan, they were nothing. He likely was many times stronger than them, in terms of his stats and abilities. It was hardly fair. Their bodies turned into bloody mist and chunks of metal as he methodically butchered his way through. Essence rushed in, but not nearly enough for a level. The system definitely had something to do with how much one was rewarded for a kill, as this should have been enough to rank him up. Perhaps it was something to do with the challenge of a fight. At this point, killing legions of similarly leveled fighters was not much of a challenge for him. It was not even a workout. As such, the system must have determined that he was not working hard enough for his essence, and simply took it. That seemed like the sort of thing the greedy universe-spanning AI would do. Especially considering it was him. If not for his habit of killing higher-leveled opponents, he would be stuck. Jonathan slammed and punched his way through the milling throng of guards, followed in close pursuit by Edgar, who cleared the way with his wind abilities. Corpses were lifted into the air and were thrown out the door, a very disconcerting sight to say the least. The guild members had not made their move yet, instead content to enter behind their allies. More and more guards streamed towards the invading force, but they were dealt with in the same way. However, this did not last forever. About 50 feet down the hallway, it opened up into a small courtyard with an ornately designed statue of the city lord standing in the center. Unlike most of the city, it was not cast out of black obsidian. Jonathan ignored it, instead focusing on the trio of clearly high-leveled fighters that were facing him. One of them, clutching a serrated greatsword, stepped forwards, gathering power around her blade. The woman was massive, a block of hulking muscle and steel that seemed equipped to break down a city wall in a single charge. She laughed, a low, guttural noise, and then slashed with her sword. The blade cut through the air like a razor, shaving a piece of the world out of place, or so it seemed. A glowing red slash was left hovering in the air, which opened wider and wider over time. A moment later, a burst of red-hot lava poured out, compressed into a blade-like shape by the small size of the aperture. Jonathan dodged the attack, which streaked by, widening over time. It cut through the ground, melting the highly durable obsidian. Tartarus was a treasure trove of high-leveled materials, and this entire building was made from Tier 2 resources. It was not enough to render it completely immune to attack, but it was still able to prevent the slash from taking out the entire building. Jonathan raced towards the woman, who met his charge. The other two fighters barreled in behind her, snorting in rage. Edgar started to gather his elemental power around his wrists and hands, creating concentrated accumulations of power. A moment later, twin spears of wind shot down from the air, straight towards the fighters trailing behind the woman. As Jonathan's fist met her blade in an explosion of sparks, the spears of wind flattened the two Uthraki into the ground. They snarled, rising from the floor, and leaped over the heads of Jonathan and the female Uthraki, heading for Edgar. The guild members headed in for the first time, drawing blades from their clothing. Most of them wielded daggers, but a few had short swords. The weapons did not seem exactly the right choice for a head-on assault, but a moment later Jonathan was proven wrong. Normally, this group would have assailed the citadel from a side entrance, but there were none here. The city lord had done his due diligence in protecting his abode. Although these people were likely used to using their blades in the darkness, of which there was quite little here, they were quite adept at using them normally as well. Each of them was not an individual match for the powerful Uthraki guards, but they were able to dogpile the stronger fighters, lashing out with their blades. They weaved a storm of steel around their targets, not giving them much room to breathe. Jonathan ignored them for now, focusing on his own fight. Edgar had peeled off to help the lower-leveled guild members, leaving Jonathan to deal with his own opponent. The guildmaster was nowhere to be found, which was a pity. His strength would have been useful here. As a swipe of the sword came around at head level, Jonathan leaned over backwards, letting the blade pass over his head. He reached up and snatched at the sword, grabbing its edge with his gauntlet hands. The one benefit of using gauntlets as a weapon was that it allowed the wielder to grab things too dangerous to hold with bare hands. However, the sword was still quite sharp, and the woman started to pulse energy down the side of the weapon, sending uncomfortable tremors down Jonathan's arm. He rose, yanking at the weapon with his superior strength. The Uthraki grunted as she stumbled forwards, straight into a left hook that connected with her face. The woman spat out blood and teeth fragments as she was sent tumbling backwards, and she almost fell. Jonathan only detected the buildup of energy in her weapon at the last moment. It had been a feint the entire time. He let go just before the weapon erupted into red light, sending a series of powerful energy slashes out into the place where his hand had just been. The slashes streaked through the air, cutting through the obsidian like butter. If that had struck his hand, it would have been severed. The woman pulled the blade back swiftly, whirling around. The blade came in like a tornado, swirling up the wind around it. Jonathan had a similar ability however, and he punched forwards, channeling the conceptual power of fists of the hurricane. The skill made the air around his fist compress, even more than it normally would have. The two strikes met with a bang, and Jonathan started to channel his void energy into it. The sword began to crack, but the Uthraki woman sent her own elemental energy to meet it. Many of the Uthraki used a strange red power that seemed to be a blend of earth and fire. It was like the sub-element of lava, or something like that. It was interesting that so many of the Uthraki possessed it, but it made sense, given the world surrounding them. It would be easy enough for them to form a connection to the element that surrounded them on a daily basis. As the fight started to heat up, Jonathan grinned. Perhaps this would be a little more of a challenge than normal. All he could think about was how these fighters compared to his own Uthraki allies. He idly wondered how Husher and the others were doing. In the ash heaps. Two brothers. Two previously incompatible fighters, now working as one. Uthraki and Husher's burning rage had been cooled over time by their work in service of Jonathan's city. Now they fought side by side to hunt the monsters of the wastes. The local game were too weak to prove much of a challenge to the highly leveled Uthraki, but that was not the point. The area surrounding the city was a blasted wasteland of ash and monsters, but it felt far calmer than the volcanic land of Tartarus, where both men had grown up. It was far less dangerous too, given that they both significantly outleveled most of the monsters. After realizing that their survival and future depended on their ability to work together, as well as the natural decrease in hatred that close proximity brought, they had decided to make up for the mistakes of the past, and go into their future together. Their upbringings had not instilled them with much in the way of emotional stubbornness, and they were perfectly happy to reconcile with one another. It was fitting that they chose to do this through shared pursuit of a monstrous quarry, given that had been what had driven them apart in the first place. Still, sometimes the universe had a sense of irony. As Uthraki skewered an alpha ash prowler on a spike of rock, Husher beheaded it with his axe, grinning slightly. The monsters themselves fell like wheat before their weapons, and as they bathed in the blood of multitudes, they felt their battles bind them together as surely as if they were linked body and soul. Neither man would admit it, but they had missed one another. Family was hard to come by in the brutal world of Tartarus, but they had it now. The raw elemental energy being channeled by the two fighters started to mingle and rupture as they pushed more and more of their power into the sword that they were fighting over. The red light of the Uthraki's energy, and the purple light of Jonathan's, eventually found that they would go no further. Compressed to their utmost within the blade, they detonated, sending both fighters flying. Jonathan groaned as he rolled across the hard obsidian ground. His front side was bruised, but mostly unharmed. The Uthraki fighter was already standing, with her sword held out to the side. Cracks ran up and down its length, and some of the serrated teeth on it were mangled and broken. A look of pure rage was on her face, and she sank into a low stance. Power rushed to her feet, and what looked like a tendril of lava reached out from the bases of her armored soles. It streaked across the ground towards Jonathan, and a moment later, the woman vanished. A flitting shape moved along with the stream of lava at a speed higher than Jonathan could easily make out. A moment later, she appeared in front of him, her sword clasped tightly. It came down a moment later, its edge coated with elemental energy. Jonathan tried to dodge, but he was too slow, and the strike barreled into his shoulder. His bones almost broke under the onslaught, but they narrowly remained intact. He was driven to one knee by the force however, and fell straight into a brutal kick from his opponent. He rolled with the force, but it still knocked out a few of his teeth. A triumphant laugh came from the Uthraki, which Jonathan ignored. He was not fighting at his full capacity here. With a snarl, he sent his stamina to his legs, sending him shooting up towards his enemy like a rocket. His fist hammered into the underside of the Uthraki's chin, sending her dozens of feet into the air. Shattered teeth fell like white rain onto the ground, and a spray of blood followed. As the Uthraki came down, Jonathan pulled back his fist, and sent all of his power to it. A whirling storm of energy gathered there, and as the Uthraki touched the ground, Jonathan surged forwards and punched. His fist buried itself into the Uthraki's abdomen, feeling a moment of resistance. Then it broke through, and the woman was reduced to a rapidly dissipating shockwave of gore. Essence rushed into Jonathan, sending him up another level for his trouble. Behind him, the two Uthraki who had accompanied the woman were rapidly losing their battles, covered in hundreds of lacerations from the guild members. However, they were giving as good as they got, and Jonathan knew that if he did not step in, there would be more than a few casualties before this was all over. With a steely glance, Jonathan gathered his energy up within himself, and pushed off the durable obsidian. It cracked as he pushed off, but did not shatter, as any lesser material would have. Like a streak of red and purple lightning, he flashed towards his enemies, faster than they could react to. Both his fists buried themselves in their backs, shattering bone and pulping flesh. He lifted the two fighters off their feet and into the air, where he proceeded to hit them with a barrage of punches, each glowing with the light of the void. In their weakened state, they were no match for him, and gravity was far too weak to stop him from reaping his due. In the time that they fell even a single foot, dozens of strikes had landed, turning flesh to jelly in the process. By the time they hit the floor, the Uthraki were dead, and more essence, less than before, entered Jonathan. However, he still was able to gain a level from it. This venture was proving to be quite profitable, if nothing else. The guild members withdrew their blades and started to clean them off as if this was nothing more than an ordinary occurrence. With stony-faced looks, they headed deeper into the building. This time, it was Jonathan and Edgar who were trailing them. As they hurried to catch up, Edgar gave Jonathan a glance. Those fighters act quite strangely. Almost as if they are being controlled by some outside force. Jonathan had noticed something off as well, in their synchronized movements, as well as their seeming immunity to pain and fear. No normal fighters could work together in such a tight group so flawlessly. Normally, having dozens of people attacking a single target was a recipe for disaster, as most of their strikes would be blocked by their allies. However, they had made it work somehow. Before they were left too far behind, however, Jonathan picked up the pace, thinking over what Edgar had said. In any case, it hardly mattered right now, seeing as they were allies. As they followed in the wake of the Uthraki, they heard more fighting coming from the front of the pack, as the guild members engaged their enemies. Edgar sent his own attacks over their heads, aiding the Uthraki with them. Jonathan was unable to do so, so he simply waited until the Uthraki had dealt with the threat. He needed to save his energy for the big boss at the end. Judging by the aura that he had felt, he would need to use all of his power to take out the city lord. As the Uthraki slowly made their way along the hallway, which seemed to stretch for far longer than was feasible, Uthraki guards jumped out of the side rooms, landing in front of Jonathan and the others. Looks of malice burned on their faces, as if they were enraged that someone would care to invade their master's sanctum. Before they could react, however, Jonathan blasted a few of them to splinters of bone and flesh. Now that his level was approaching that of his foes, it was growing easier and easier to defeat them. Edgar picked up the slack, and eviscerated a few of the fighters with his wind skills, sending them in through cracks in their armor. The abilities would never have gotten through the highly durable armor otherwise. However, with his elemental energy, Edgar was a master at breaking through barriers. Eventually, they reached the end of the hallway, finding themselves in a large atrium, where a throne stood. On that throne was the city lord, clutching a massive sword that blazed with light. Around him were a dozen of the strongest Uthraki that Jonathan had even seen, with their own colossal weaponry. With a rage-filled glare, the city lord got to his feet. "You filth think that you can invade my palace? You degenerate scum, gathered from the streets of this city by that addled old man. I will kill you here and now, and then string you up off the city walls as a reminder to never disobey me." Mortan screamed the last few words, and launched himself from his throne towards them. With a roar of rage, he raised his sword over his head, sending energy into it. Like shadows of his motion, the other Uthraki sprang into action, mirroring his movements. Jonathan gathered his power to his fists, and sent divinity rushing through his body, not wasting any time. His improved smite went off without a hitch, and his body filled with golden power. With a roar, he jumped, sending himself on a collision course with his enemy. Finally, a worthy dash, the Uthraki began. He was interrupted by Jonathan. "Seriously? A movie reference, and you're not even from my world?" The man froze, his face in a strange position. Then Jonathan surged forwards, moving like a bolt of purple lightning. Each step turned the rock beneath him to dust, and by the time he reached his enemy, he was moving at a speed well beyond the ability of anyone save for the city lord to see. However, even the city lord was hard-pressed to track him. Instead, the Uthraki summoned a massive slab of molten rock to the end of his blade, creating a gargantuan paddle of cooling rock around it. Jonathan's eyes widened, but he was unable to dodge in time. The attack hit him like a massive fleiswater, and he was blasted backwards, his bones fracturing under the strike. The city lord might have been a bit slower than Jonathan, but he was stronger as well. Jonathan skidded to a halt amidst the warring Uthraki. None of them made a move towards him, too engrossed in their own battle. Jonathan would have helped, but he lacked the time. He ducked under a lightning-fast strike from the thin edge of the molten sword, and watched as it bisected a few of the Uthraki, turning them into chunks of flesh. It was not a tidy way to go. His fist moved perfectly, hammering home into the small gap in the Uthraki's defenses. His clawed gauntlet smashed into Morton's windpipe. While it would not be fatal at this level, a smashed windpipe would be very distracting. Besides, his main targets were the vertebrae. His fist blasted the man backwards, and he felt the satisfying crunch of bone under his gauntlet. The Uthraki was bent around the strike, and slammed into the wall a moment later. With the crack of shattering obsidian, a nova of red light exploded outwards from the warlord, turning into a storm of razor-sharp obsidian fragments. They pinged off of Jonathan's armor without causing much harm, but they ripped through the far more lightly armored fighters from the guild. With a booming laugh that quickly turned into a storm of coughing from the smashed windpipe, the Uthraki city lord came crashing down in front of Jonathan, a red glint in his eyes. That was Jonathan's only cue that an enhancement ability had been triggered. There was a shockwave as the Uthraki took off, and for the briefest of moments, he was entirely invisible. A fist that felt like a city-sized cannon going off smashed into Jonathan's torso, crushing his organs and bones alike. Then the enhancement faded, and Mortan stumbled. Jonathan skipped across the unyielding ground like a stone, each impact driving the breath out of his lungs. He came to a screeching halt against the side of the room, gasping in pain. His body felt like it had been put through a rock tumbler, and he could barely get up. He could see the form of Mortan stumbling towards him, through blurry eyes, and he forced himself to his feet. Smite was still running, but absorbing that strike had done a number on his reserves. He had about another minute left with the skill, if not less. Jonathan levered himself to his feet, grunting from the effort, and faced off against the Uthraki leader. With a snarl, he tensed his muscles, trying to snap out of the haze that he was in. His entire stomach was basically ruined, and blood leaked out of the corners of his mouth. However, he was still alive. Mortan was rapidly recovering from the skill he had used, which meant that Jonathan only had a few seconds to make this count. With a bellow of rage, made far quieter by the state of his lungs, he burst forwards, ignoring the pain that shot through his body. He reached Mortan a moment later, and drove a desperate uppercut into the man's chin, weaving it through the shoddy defense that the worn-out Uthraki provided. Mortan was lifted off his feet, and Jonathan wound up for another strike. However, His body almost gave out, and he simply stumbled into the man instead of dodging. Jonathan saw the world start to dim around himself, and he knew that if he fell here, it would all be over. Instead, he gathered his will, and drove his shaking fist into Morton's stomach. The man flew away a few dozen feet, giving Jonathan room to breathe. Without hesitation, he dumped half of his free stat points into resilience. He had been meaning to save them for dexterity, but in this situation, he needed the durability. As the stat points took effect, he could feel his body tightening up, and healing some of the damage from before. With a sigh of relief, he faced off against the Uthraki leader, more confident than before. He weaved across the ground, gathering up speed as he moved. With a roar of rage, he propelled himself across the last few feet, meeting Morton's unstable sword strike with a punch of his own. Morton stumbled backwards, and Jonathan moved in, barraging the man with a storm of void-enhanced punches. Morton shuddered as the energy rushed into his body, tearing it apart from the inside. Jonathan's own body was tearing itself apart, but he forced himself to keep moving, using the little bit of durability that he had gained to keep himself moving. As he punched, he thought of everything that was riding on him, from the freedom of the Hells to the survival of his city. Even the life of Edgar, who would likely die if Morton was left alive. His punches seemed to grow stronger, and although Jonathan knew that the strength he was drawing on was the ultimate cliché, it still worked. Perhaps the power of friendship did have some merit after all. Morton tried to muster a return strike, but the man was on his last legs, from the combination of the finisher move he had used, to the effects of the rest of the fight. Eventually, Jonathan broke through his last, paltry defense, and cracked his head open with a devastating punch, filled with as much of his remaining power that he could muster. As essence entered him, propelling him up an entire 2 levels, Jonathan smiled. As he did so, a shadowy form could be seen falling from the sky, landing in the midst of the warring Uthraki. The guildmaster had finally shown himself. As Jonathan faded into unconsciousness, Edgar was fighting for his life. His attacks were not enough to take out any of the highly durable Uthraki that he was fighting within a reasonable amount of time, and the allies that he had were too weak to achieve the same with their weapons. At least now that Jonathan had killed the city lord, they had a chance. As Jonathan collapsed next to the body of his latest conquest, Edgar spotted a figure leaping over the heads of the fighters, blazing with energy. It was the guildmaster. He landed with a sharp crack, burying his blades in the heads of 2 of the enemy Uthraki. They slumped over, dead upon impact. With a cry of triumph at the sight of the dead Morton, the guildmaster threw himself into the fray, helping his allies push back the elite Uthraki fighters. To their credit, none of them seemed willing to retreat, and they stood their ground until the bloody end. As they died, Edgar rushed over to Jonathan's side, watching as the man's body slowly started to regenerate the damage taken. He was in rough shape, but given a few hours, he would be back on his feet. Jonathan had lived through worse. Jonathan rose from the blackness some time later, feeling like his body had been put through a meat grinder. He was battered and bruised all over, and his stomach ached like he had just gotten the worst case of food poisoning possible. However, it was a far cry from earlier, and for that, he was thankful. He was lying on the floor of the guild hall, with Edgar sitting beside him, playing with a ball of wind. As Jonathan rose, Edgar gave him a smile. "How are you feeling?" "You took a lot of damage from that fight," Edgar asked, the smile fading. "I've felt better, but I can't really complain. I'll be back in fighting shape soon enough." Edgar simply nodded at this, and let Jonathan rest in silence. The first thing he did was open his stat sheet. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 2. Void Human, Advanced. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon Elemental Mastery, 10%. Elemental Juggernaut, Tier 2 Legendary Level 154. 44 free points. Strength. 1245. Dexterity. 928. Constitution. 636. Resilience. 712. Intelligence. 672. Wisdom. 665. Divinity. 10. Health, 9540/9540 stamina, 28013/28013 mana, 10080/10080. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique Nascent God, Transcendent Forceful Initiate, Mythical Lesser Xenocide, Legendary Iron Will, Epic. Leader of Men, Epic Refined. Form, Epic Giant Slayer, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Greater Smite, Mythical. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Void Cannon, Legendary. Stamina Redirection, Legendary. Channeled Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Fists of the Hurricane, Epic. Battle Focus, Rare. Impact, Rare. Focused Scry, Rare. Runes of Power, Rare. Redirect, Uncommon. Pathway Skills. Mana Manipulation, Journeyman 2 Runecrafting, Journeyman 1 Martial Arts, Journeyman 1 True Sight, Journeyman 1. Martial Path. Flowing Hurricane, Journeyman 1 Quests. The Strongest. Hellbreaker, Impossible. Complete Vengeance, SSS. Wolf Among the Lambs, A. His stats were starting to look up, moving towards the level that he wanted. All of his stats were over the midpoint of the first 1,000, and were approaching the second threshold. Now that he knew the power that such a thing granted, he would not let his fear dissuade him again. He needed the strength to defeat Granath. The only way to beat that powerful of a mage was to do so with overwhelming physical force. All of his magical skills would be useless against the hegemon of elemental power, at least as they were now, and he would need to cultivate his physical body as well. However, internal mana use would still be valuable. He decided to save the remainder of his free points until he had enough to cross his threshold. A little bump in dexterity would hardly be useful now, and he only had a few more levels to go before he could cross the threshold. At that point, his speed would be hundreds of times greater than a normal human, which was an astounding amount. It would allow him to cross the sound barrier many times over at his top speed. However, that was all for naught if he simply died to Granath. A moment later, a quest notification popped up. You have completed a quest. Wolf Among the Lambs, A. You have been rewarded with 1 ton of Tier 2 iron, 3 natural treasures of your choice, and pick of 1 item from the city treasury. Speak with the guildmaster for your reward. Jonathan slowly got to his feet, groaning as he did so. However, the thought of the rewards from the quest allowed him to keep going. As he rose, Edgar rose with him. They exited the city hall, and headed out into the streets, making their way back to the guild headquarters. As they entered, the 2 men walked towards the center of the guild hall, where a large group of guild members were waiting. All of them were clustered around the guildmaster, who was giving some sort of speech. It wrapped up as the 2 men approached, however, just in time for the man to spot them. "Ah, my erstwhile allies. Here for your reward?" he asked. Jonathan nodded. "Good, come with me then. Such amounts of treasure cannot be easily transported. Not because of their weight, but because of their size." The man headed towards a door at the back of the room, and opened it, sliding his hand across a panel to do so. The door opened with a slight creak, revealing a long staircase leading down. They followed the guildmaster into the hole, and eventually reached the bottom, coming out in front of a large cavern filled with treasure. It was organized by its type, and their first stop was a massive or depository. There was a large block of iron waiting there, next to a smaller block of some mineral, presumably for Edgar. It was smaller than he would have expected, but then again, metal was quite dense. However, He could see where the guildmaster had been coming from when he had mentioned how unwieldy it would be to carry. With a smile, Jonathan put it in his storage device, along with Edgar's block of crystal, thankful for the small size. The Uthraki raised an eyebrow at this, but did not say anything, instead leading them over to the area where the natural treasures were kept. There were a few dozen, of all shapes and sizes, ranging from fruits, which seemed to be a common form of such objects, to what looked like body parts. Take your pick. Only 3 each though, the guildmaster said. Jonathan and Edgar nodded, heading over towards the racks. He had learned that Edgar did not actually have a scanning skill, instead using a magical item. It was a small ring, one that he had been allowed to keep by Granath during his captivity, for some reason. It allowed him to scan things at his tier, and was powered by his mana. As a result, he was able to select his own treasures, without needing Jonathan to scan them for him. Jonathan instead started to peruse them. He ruled out all of the ones that were keyed to elements other than his own. That cut out almost half of them. What was left were a motley crew of physical enhancements, seeing as there were no fruits keyed to the element of the void. Some of them increased durability, whereas others increased strength. When he channeled his true sight, however, he could tell that not all of them were created equal. Eventually, he narrowed the selection down to 5 treasures. The first one was a small, gnarled piece of wood that looked like a curled arm. Strength of wood. Tier 2 natural treasure. This piece of Tier 2 wood, the last remnants of a mighty titan oak tree, enhances the physical strength of those who consume it, creating a secondary heart that beats with the power of unfettered growth. The effects grow with tier, drawing from the user's own power to further its own. Jonathan closed the notification, and kept going. The other 4 treasures were just as promising as this one, but they were aspect in different ways. No matter what, he would be coming out of this with a substantial boost to his power. He put the piece of wood down, and lifted up the next natural treasure. It looked like a fleshy bulb, with liquid coursing around inside. That liquid looked disconcertingly like blood, as Jonathan could see it through a small panel of see-through material on the side. It looked quite disgusting, especially if he was expected to eat it, but it was still a treasure, and would likely provide him with many benefits. In addition to its strange shape, it gave off a faint aura of heat. He picked it up, and scanned it. Boon of the hot-blooded. Tier 2 natural treasure. A bulb from a rare species of volcanic plant, this natural treasure contained the pure elemental blood of a volcano itself. Eating the bulb will increase the consumer's natural red blood cell concentration, allowing them to achieve more for the same amount of stamina use. In addition, their blood will become molten, able to harm anyone who breaks through their skin. This one looked promising, and Jonathan put it to the side. He wanted the treasure after hearing about increasing the efficiency of his stamina usage. The molten blood was only a bonus on top. The next treasure was what looked to be a crystallized lightning bolt, made out of clear crystal. It thrummed with electrical power, and when Jonathan picked it up, it felt like it was trying to get out of his hand, not willing to be bound for too long. Conduit of speed. Tier 2 natural treasure. This crystallized shard of pure lightning was sourced from one of the lower-tier elemental planes. Breaking the crystal and consuming the resulting dust grants the user the speed of lightning, increasing both the ability of their muscles to use greater speed, as well as their nerves to keep up. Be warned, unless your strength and resilience are on par, this treasure can lead to injury. Jonathan put this one on the maybe list. He would be crossing his threshold soon in dexterity, and he did not want something that could potentially be a danger, not until he saw the other options at least. The 4th natural treasure was a pink crystal that looked like a brain. It was only a faint resemblance, but it was still there. The crystal looked like it was an actual brain, if Jonathan let his elemental sight loose. It was a strange effect, and one that he was intrigued by. Wisdom of the Earth. Tier 2 natural treasure. Consuming this crystal will grant the user the ability to tap into the knowledge of the earth, using their surroundings as a repository for information. It grants access to a special skill that creates a library of information, beyond the memory capacity of even a peak tier 2. If Jonathan had been a mage, this would have been interesting, but as it was, he set it back. The last treasure was the strangest of the lot. A large mammalian hand, it was dried and preserved by what looked like desiccation. Thick black fur was still visible on the back of the hand, and it looked like one of those monkey's paw trinkets back on Earth. Perhaps this was the same thing. Book of Ecrithes. Tier 2 Natural Treasure. This treasure can be used once, and will grant a single wish. As long as that wish is within the parameters of the essence contained within this treasure, it will be granted. An example parameter for the treasure would be an instant bonus of 100 stat points to each stat, not affected by multipliers. The only other limitation is the imagination of the user. Just going by the potential stat bonus alone, this one was coming with him. Although it did not provide a scaling bonus like the others, a single boost to his power would be welcome. Jonathan picked up the paw, and after a quick moment of deliberation, picked up the boon of the hot-blooded, as well as the strength of wood natural treasures. Starting with the strength of wood, he started to consume them. Eating the essence-enhanced piece of wood was like chewing on a branch. However, the wood began to soften as soon as it entered his mouth, and it eventually dissolved into a pool of energy. The energy rushed down his throat and into his muscles, empowering them beyond their previous limits. It felt like something was growing within him, something huge and implacable. Now that he had consumed the treasure. However, he realized that if there was no limit to the number that could be eaten, Granath was probably stacked in terms of them. The worm likely had consumed hundreds of the things in his time, if not thousands. Warning, you are approaching the tier 2 limit on natural treasure consumption. You have 2 more left before that limit is reached. Jonathan sighed. Although he would not be gaining any more strength from treasures after this, at least Granath would be stuck with the same amount. A moment later, he slid the bulb-like orb of the next treasure down his throat, wincing as it popped with a disturbing noise. Fluid rushed down his throat, quickly turning into vapor that soaked into his bloodstream. It felt like something had set his blood on fire, but the pain only lasted for a few moments. When it left, he felt better than ever before. His blood felt like it had been energized by the treasure, and it was able to carry more oxygen and essence through his bloodstream. He pulled back his arm, marveling at how smooth the motion felt now. With a grin, he pulled out the last of the treasures. This one would require a bit more thought. He wanted to use it to shore up his weaknesses, but unless he was specific enough, he would waste its full potential. The stat boost option was also good as well, if he was unable to think of something else. The first thing that came to mind, his divinity, would not be an option. Only divinity could increase the power of divinity after all. Although this boon was powerful, it was not that powerful. In that vein, the treasure could not improve his mastery over the void, nor make his skills in that area more powerful. What was left were his more mundane attributes. He already knew about the stat bonus, so he simply moved on from that. His next thought was upgrading his class to the next rarity, but when he tried to make his wishes known to the treasure, it glowed red. It seemed that was too much power for the treasure. The limits were not oppressive, but still annoying. Calculating the total stat bonus allowed Jonathan to see that he could add up to 600 points to any stat. Of course, that was a terrible idea, as it would lead to drastic imbalance. Another idea that popped up was breaking one of his stats through a threshold early, allowing him to double up on the next threshold. However, that was yet another terrible idea. If he did that for strength, he would never be able to get his other stats to a similar level, and he would probably end up killing himself. Then something came to mind that was likely within the parameters. Upgrading his race. Because a race could be upgraded at any time, as long as one had the threshold to do so, it would probably take less energy to do so. It was not entirely dependent on the thresholds either, as they seemed to be more of a gateway to the race, rather than what actually made the racial upgrade what it was. With an increasing conviction that this was the right idea, he conveyed his wish to the paw. A moment later, power started to course through his body, drawing from his stores of energy. His void elemental energy started to pulse within him, sending its tendrils through his body. He grunted in pain as his body was remade, his cells and bones growing stronger as he was reforged. The paw started to dissolve into light, and that light sank into him, finishing the job. As he felt new energy rushing through his veins, he smiled, opening the resulting notification. You have upgraded your race. Void Human, Potent. You gain an additional stat point per level on account of your upgraded body. In addition, your senses are greatly improved. Because of reaching this level before level 50, as well as the great personal suffering that you went through, you have retroactively gained the points from your previous levels. In addition, you have empowered your body with the energy of the void, further upgrading your natural abilities. You now gain an additional point per level, for a total of 2 extra points from this race. These points will not be gained retroactively. For upgrading your race for the 3rd time, you have gained access to a greater degree of elemental connection, making you more potent than before. Reaching this level grants you an additional 3 points per level, for a total of 5. Finally, your senses have been upgraded once more. The first thing that hit him was a massive improvement to his perception. Everything around him came into sharp focus, and he was sure that he could see the individual molecules in the world around him if he looked close enough. He could hear the thrum of the atoms around him, and he could detect everything within a 25-foot range perfectly. As he got used to the new boost, he started to filter it, so as not to overwhelm himself. The bonuses for upgrading his race were beginning to add up, and it was a larger boost than he had expected. This would allow him to get a head start on his leveling, and he would be able to gain access to the next stage of his race once he crossed all of his thresholds. The bonus might have appeared small, but as he rose through the ranks, it would increase. He had not been lured by the thought of easy power, and had picked the best option overall. Although he did not gain the retroactive points like from the last racial upgrade, he would likely do so next time. When he reached the 2nd threshold in all of his stats, he would actually gain access to the 3rd tier of racial upgrades, rather than the 2nd, as he normally would have. He suspected that the treasure that he had just used was something that could only ever happen once, when one was at the lower end of the spectrum. It would simply take too much power to force a racial upgrade beyond that. Jonathan put back the other 2 treasures, and walked over to Edgar, who was still absorbing his own. As the man lowered something that looked like a crystallized cloud into his mouth, he gave Jonathan a glance. Jonathan simply nodded, and leaned against the wall, waiting for his friend to finish. Meanwhile, the guildmaster watched from a distance, likely making sure that the men did not steal any of the treasures. The man seemed to be playing his own game to a certain degree, and Jonathan was not sure of his motives. However, he would not complain about free power. Anything that could help him survive was a welcome bonus. As they moved away from the store of treasures, the guildmaster seemed to brighten up, as if relieved that they had not stolen anything. As they approached him, he started up the stairs, and back towards the main part of the guild hall. Jonathan gave Edgar a look, and then followed. If he had not been so sure that the guildmaster had some sort of surveillance or security methods in place over this area, he would have gone back and taken some more for Eva and the other strong fighters of his city. As it was, however, he ignored them. They headed up the stairs after the guildmaster, and up into the main atrium. The man was waiting for them there, and he was smiling, now that his own part of the bargain was done. Now that you are here, you are entitled to your share from the city's treasury. Come with me. As they exited the building, Jonathan noted that the air of the city was different than before. The people seemed more friendly than before, and they were clearly enthused about the freedom of their city. Jonathan smiled at this, and kept walking, a little more of a spring in his step. It was strange that mere hours ago, he was about to kill as many of the Uthraki as he could get his hands on, but now that he realized the true nature of the conflict in this city, he was more wise about the ways of this world. Besides, he had gotten more out of this than simple levels. If he had merely butchered the Uthraki along with Edgar, all that would have happened was that they would have been run out of the city with nothing to their name. As it was, he had gained more strength from the natural treasures than he would have from mere levels. By the time they reached the city hall, which had already been reinforced by a platoon of guild members, they could see rapid deconstruction of the place happening. Now that the wards were down, the Uthraki were able to use their powers to manipulate the walls and floors of the building, and repurpose it. It was being changed from a Baroque palace to something more fitting of a guild. The towers and buttresses were being turned into more utilitarian walls, and the entrance was being widened. However, the guildmaster marched them through all of that, and into the center of the building. Beneath the throne that the city lord had been sitting on was a large trapdoor, only visible now that the throne had been removed. It led down into a darkened chamber, where the faint glint of treasure could be seen. The guildmaster pointed down at the trapdoor, and beckoned for them to enter. In their hurry to claim their goods and leave, they did not notice the devious grin that came across the man's face. About halfway down the staircase, Jonathan realized that something was wrong when he did not hear the footsteps of the guildmaster behind him. Going on pure intuition, he sent his stamina to his legs and reversed, flashing up towards the top of the staircase. However, he was a tiny bit too late. With a smile, the guildmaster shut the trapdoor. Jonathan sighed. He had been expecting nothing else when he had realized the fact that the man had not come with them. There was nothing to do but to claim their treasure and get out of there with the token. It was a bit of an annoyance, but nothing too major. Bastard, Jonathan muttered to himself as he headed down the stairs. Then he felt a tiny prick on his left arm. He frowned, but it did not come back immediately. As he descended, he felt it again, about 20 seconds later. He reached the place where Edgar was a moment later, and gave the man a shrug. "Well, that was unexpected," Edgar said. "However, we can simply leave." The man twitched as he felt the same sting on his arm. Jonathan started to have a sneaking suspicion what the meaning of the twinges were. He pulled out the token, and to his horror, it did not engage. It seemed that they were trapped in combat by the tiny pricks on their bodies. The guildmaster had been wiser than they had realized. "Motherfew dash," Jonathan began, before realizing that they still had access to the treasury. Perhaps there was something there that could aid them. He summoned a bright ball of void light to his right hand, and started walking down the staircase and into the treasury. It was a large repository, filled with crystals, metals and other valuable objects. There were some weapons strewn around the area, and some armor as well. None of them were as good as the gear that Jonathan and Edgar had, but they would be useful for the citizens of the city. However, none of that was useful if they did not find out the secret of the twinges on their arms. It was ridiculous that such a small thing would be what prevented them from escaping, but the rules of the token were the rules. For them to be counted as in combat, the attacks would have to be coming from a living source, or at least something with a degree of sapience. That meant that it could be killed. Before they started to ransack the treasury, Jonathan sent more mana into his hand, making the light brighter. It cast the area in stark radiance, making everything stand out. However, there was nothing visible save for the treasure. Whatever was in here was invisible, or incredibly small. Either way, it was not readily apparent. Jonathan did not let on to his suspicions however, and instead made his way towards the nearest pile of weapons. Catching on, Edgar did the same. As they went, Jonathan started to surreptitiously etch runes of consumption onto the ground, disguising them with the constant light coming from his beacon of energy. He simply made it look like he was bending down to inspect another piece of armor or the like. If anything living stepped onto one of the runes, it would trigger, revealing their location. The only thing that Jonathan needed to do was to avoid them. As he moved, he kept his senses open for anything within his vicinity, but was unable to detect a presence. Whatever was in here was quite elusive. The other thing that confused him was how the guildmaster knew about the token. Perhaps the man had been alive in Granath's time, and such knowledge had been widespread there. Either way, it was unclear. All that mattered now was getting out here. Jonathan started to make a circuit of the room, laying his traps down everywhere that he could. As he went, he tidied up the most enticing pieces of armor and weaponry into his storage device, making it look like he was simply looting. Edgar made sure to stay ahead of him as they went, and eventually, Jonathan heard a noise. He whirled around, and saw one of the runes glowing brightly as it sucked the mana out of something. He dashed towards the source of the light and snapped his hand out, grabbing something out of the air that he could not see. It felt like a person, albeit an incredibly small one. As he touched it, however, the invisibility wore off, revealing a grotesquely twisted Uthraki that was barely 3 feet tall. Its face looked like a lump of gnarled flesh. The creature had a small blowpipe clutched in one hand, with a quiver of bolts strapped to its torso. Even worse than its appearance, however, was the fact that it was completely naked, leaving nothing to the imagination. It kicked and squealed as Jonathan held it, but did not seem capable of speech. Jonathan snarled in rage, and crushed its neck with his gauntlet. He tossed the corpse to the side, and unbound the other runes that he had left in the area. Before leaving, he wanted to loot the room as much as he could. Anything that would not fit in his storage device, he would simply carry. By the time he was done, half of the treasury was within his storage device, and the other half, made up of the larger items, was within reach. Both he and Edgar made sure they were touching as much of it as possible, and then teleported back to the ash heaps. When they returned to Tartarus, they would be ready to get revenge on the duplicitous guildmaster. They popped out in the center of the cave, with their bounty tumbling everywhere. The motley collection of items looked even larger now than before, and was an impressive sight. Out of the dim light provided by their advanced senses, their haul was more intriguing than they had suspected. The vast majority of the treasury stock was made up of various Tier 2 minerals and ores, which were valuable enough. However, the armor and weapons were more important to the prospects of the city. There were enough sets to outfit over a dozen guards, and they would improve their fighting abilities drastically. Jonathan emptied out his storage device as well, letting the rest of the bounty fall out onto the ground. The cube of Tier 2 iron looked almost paltry in comparison to the rest of the treasure trove. "It looks like we gained even more out of that than if the guildmaster had been honest," Edgar observed. "Perhaps karma is real after all." Jonathan smiled at this. Edgar had a point. They started to categorize the items, and eventually had an inventory going. There were about 7 tons of various metals and crystals, about 7 Tier 2 magical foci, 17 sets of armor and the same number of weapons. There were swords, axes, and even a glaive. It was a seemingly random collection, but this sort of equipment was invaluable. Most of the Tier 2s under Grandath did not have such powerful gear, as their only source of such gear was the dungeon, and the dungeon only gave out as much as the effort put into clearing it. If it was cleared in a large group, it would give almost nothing to the individuals. Jonathan left the minerals and metals where they were, and placed the armaments in his storage device. Edgar took it, wanting to be the one to present it to Eva. Jonathan gave the man a wink, knowing full well why he wanted to do so. If they had still needed sleep, Edgar would be getting very little that night. In the meanwhile, while Edgar went off on his hormonally motivated side quest, Jonathan sorted the minerals and metal, using his scanning ability to categorize them. Half of them were simply mundane metals that were at Tier 2, but some of the crystals were rarer. To his surprise, there was actually a small amount of dawnstone. He had no idea where it had come from, but it would be a nice surprise for Edgar. The rest of the goods were slated for sale in the Universal Trading Hub. This quantity of Tier 2 materials would sell for an obscene amount of money, judging by what he had previously experienced. It would be a nice boon for the city. By the time he had finished piling up the metal, one of the many merchants of the city had been dispatched, and was waiting outside the entrance of the cave in order to take stock of the goods. Jonathan was only a novice cataloger at best, and that was because of his scanning skill. He knew little about what these things were actually worth. With a smile at the merchant, he left the cave, allowing the man to look through the stockpile. Jonathan had better things to do with his time, not least of which was training. His new levels were valuable, but he had more strengths than simply levels. Even though all of his skills would not be easy to upgrade, he would still need to do so. The path from journeyman rank to expert was a long and hard one, but he suspected that it would be worth it with the increasing stat bonuses. As he headed down from the cave, he searched for a likely place to embark upon a quick training session. He decided to go with the outside of the walls, seeing as his experiments, especially with runecrafting, could possibly get a bit dangerous. As he leaped over the wall, he smiled, ready to get to work. Without needing food, water or sleep, he could train for a very long time. The next week passed in the blink of an eye. Jonathan ran through his most important pathway skills in the process, managing to gain some upgrades. His runecrafting had been boosted by constant creation of his runic arrays, which he quickly had to banish so as to not have a damaging effect on the landscape. However, he had managed to increase it by a single rank. His true sight skill had followed suit. As he had gone through the motions of creating the runes, he had made sure to study every last iota of their forms in order to gain insight into how they worked. Doing so had been annoying, but ultimately worth it. In between waiting for his divinity to recharge, he had practiced with his martial arts skills, whirling through the motions like a dervish. When every strike broke through the sound barrier, it was tempting to test it out on the nearest fortification, which in this case was his city. Obviously, Jonathan refrained, instead using his strength on the ground. With his threshold passed, and his other bonuses, each strike from his fists, without his gauntlets on, was able to blast a large crater in the ground. The outside of the city walls were soon littered with the remnants of his training arc, but that was fine in the end. He had managed to eke out a level in both his greater martial arts skill as well as his fists of the hurricane sub-skill. The only skill that had not improved was mana manipulation, given that it was already at the second tier, and would be too hard to upgrade in the time frame that he had. He would have had to dedicate the entire week to simply investigating his mana core, which would have been a waste of time. Now that he was done, however, it was time to finally cross that threshold that he had been waiting for. Jonathan called down Husher to fix up the damage dealt to the plane, and headed back towards his cave. When he walked through the city gates, he was immediately able to see the changes that the sudden influx of money had made. Some of the buildings had actual glass windows now, and there were strange vehicles parked on the sides of the roads that looked like a cross between a bicycle and a living being. They hummed disconcertingly as they waited, and Jonathan saw a few in action. The machines whirred down the road, using a plethora of tiny feet to move. It was a strange sight, but one that was not unwelcome. Many of the weaker members of the city needed such transportation options to get around. Jonathan walked past all of that, noting a few weapon embankments that had sprung up in between houses. A collection of cannons of some form littered the free spaces of the city. They looked dangerous, easily a dozen feet long and crackling with power. None of them had been fired yet, but Jonathan could see that they would do a lot of damage. The main difference that he could see, however, was that the guards were now equipped with higher quality weapons. The strongest ones wielded Tier 2 weapons, while the weaker ones used high-quality Tier 1 weapons. As he passed the fully kitted-out platoons, they saluted him, knowing the source of their new equipment. Jonathan saluted them back, but continued on his way. By the time he had reached the cave, he was no longer astounded by the changes made to the city. The amount of raw materials that he had brought back had been worth a large amount of money, a large amount indeed. Such an influx could have only had positive effects on the city. The cave was empty, and Jonathan headed towards the back, ready to go through his incredibly painful threshold ceremony. He currently had 44 free stat points, which was enough to grant him 73 stat points if he allocated them in the most optional manner. Luckily enough for him, he was 72 points away from ranking up. With a sigh, gritting his teeth in preparation for the pain to come, he allocated the points. As his dexterity increased, his muscles started to tense and loosen. The motion felt fine at first, as if he was simply stretching, but then it began to speed up, tearing apart his muscles in the process. His body began to vibrate, turning to jelly in the process. As usual, his nerves remained intact, the will of the sadistic system. He became nothing more than a puddle on the ground, quivering in torment. Then the pain began to abate, and he found his body coming back together once more. With a groan, he rose to his feet, feeling like he had just downed a dozen espresso shots. His entire body felt full of energy and speed, and when he raised one hand, he could see it shaking rapidly as it got used to his new speed. The threshold notification popped up a moment later. You have passed the second threshold of dexterity. In your journey of progression, you have learned that the speed of one's body is the speed of one's ascent. A dumb, plodding brute may be able to obliterate anything slow enough to stand in their way, but they will be torn apart by a true devotee of speed. You are taking your first major step on this road of power. Be sure that you do not become its final victim. Once the soul-rending pain was said and done, the boosts from a threshold were like nothing else imaginable. Before he was able to fully analyze his gains, another notification appeared. You have gained a new title. Hasteful Initiate, Mythical. You have crossed the second threshold of dexterity while still in Tier 2. This shows one of two things. Either you are a prodigy beyond measure, or an idiot who focused entirely on one stat over all else. Bonuses, plus 10% boost to effective dexterity utilization. Jonathan felt like he was on top of the world with his massive increase in speed. Everything around him felt like it was going in slow motion, and he swore that he could see the very molecules moving in his vicinity. That was only an illusion, of course, but his speed was significant now. He was over 200 times faster than a normal person, meaning that he could run at thousands of miles per hour, and move his extremities at dozens of times the speed of sound. Even scarier, this was only the beginning. At a certain point, he would be able to move faster than the speed of light, if such a thing was possible here. Given the existence of gods, he assumed that it was. Jonathan took a step out into the outside world, marveling at how slow everything appeared. Luckily he was able to mitigate this effect, or else it would have been hard to do anything. Speaking to one of the lower-level citizens would have been impossible, except for the fact that he could limit his speed. He looked down at the city below him, coupling his racial upgrade with his speed. He could see the citizens moving like they were frozen in space and time, and when he slowed down his perception, the effects were barely better. He had to reduce his speed by a sizable amount in order to see at a normal level once more. Walking down towards the city, he had an idea. The center of the city was about half a mile away, which was quite a distance for him to cross quickly, even before his threshold. Now however, he sensed that he could push himself a bit further. Summoning his stamina to his legs, he raced forwards for a few feet to build up momentum and then pushed off. His perception blacked out for a moment, and he found himself standing in front of the city hall, with a long skid mark visible on the mountainside. He shook his head to clear it, and marveled at the new power that he possessed. People all around him were staring at his sudden appearance. To their eyes, it would have looked like he had teleported into the middle of the city. With a grin, Jonathan walked off. He wanted to find Edgar. It was time to get revenge on the Uthraki guildmaster. Although no harm had come of it in the end, it would not be wise to leave an opponent so knowledgeable about the weaknesses of outsiders alive. Edgar was busy regaling a group of guards with a heavily embellished tale about his exploits in Tartarus, no doubt spurred on by the presence of Eva sitting next to him. What city was this? Jonathan asked mildly. I feel like I would have remembered something like that. Edgar spluttered, as Jonathan stared down at him. Then Jonathan let out a loud guffaw and slapped Edgar on the back, nearly knocking him over. Just make sure the object of your tales is not nearby, eh? Edgar began, but Jonathan shook his head. It doesn't matter. I have something to show you though. Edgar nodded, giving Eva a quick hug before he went off. As they left, Jonathan heard the woman continuing the story, and he let out a soft groan. He would never hear the end of this. At least the citizens were getting over their fear for him. That was good. He took Edgar back up the mountain, and showed him the skid mark left by his movements. Then he showed the man his actual speed. Within the span of a second, he raced to the top of the mountain and back down. It was a small mountain, but that was still incredibly quick. "I think it's time for revenge," Jonathan said, his voice darkening. "I agree," Edgar replied, cracking his knuckles. "I hope you haven't spent the last week doing nothing more than spreading rumors then." "For your sake." Edgar merely chuckled. Jonathan pulled out the token, nodded at Edgar, and then whisked them away to Tartarus. This time, they would stay there until they had gained enough power. Jonathan wanted to get to at least level 175 before he started to scout out the rest of the ash heaps. By that point, he would be like an army all on his own. Some time later, they found themselves standing within the heavily warded treasury of the Uthraki city. Except this time, there was nothing preventing them from leaving. No doorway, sealed shut. No annoying invisible Uthraki to keep them from teleporting away. It had been long enough that the Uthraki guildmaster likely thought that they were long gone. Unfortunately for him, however, Jonathan never forgot an affront. With a grin, he and Edgar walked up the stairs of the treasury, and into the palace that took up the central area of the city. Now that it had been converted into something that looked like a guild hall, it was a bit less ostentatious than before. Still, it seemed that the guildmaster had some expensive tastes of his own, and there was a large statue of him at its center now. Jonathan and Edgar slunk around the halls, keeping out of sight of the others. By the time that they were standing near the throne room, they could hear conversation from within. Jonathan peeked around the corner, and saw the guildmaster himself, sitting on the throne. It had been remodeled to fit the man's personality, and was now crowned with spikes of darkened metal. However, the guildmaster himself looked exactly the same. Now that Jonathan knew his true colors, the man looked almost pitiful. He had always been small for an Uthraki, and it was only now that Jonathan was actually realizing this. He smiled as he saw the height difference between the man and his guards. It hardly mattered, of course, but it was still gratifying. Rather than wait for the room to clear, Jonathan simply strode in. He had nothing to worry about here. Behind him, Edgar started to cast his ranged abilities, one of which filled Jonathan with even more speed than before. With the power of Edgar's buff roiling through his body, he felt like a god of speed. As he entered the room, the conversation puttered out. "We meet again," Jonathan said, leaning into his persona as an implacable, inexorable conqueror. He knew that the Uthraki leader's psyche must have been in shambles, given the fact that they had escaped. The other man spluttered, but then seemed to get his composure together. He snapped his fingers, and a dome of light fell down from the ceiling at high speeds. However, Jonathan was not the same man that he had been when his presence had last graced these halls. He surged forwards, and dodged the attack, moving out of its range with ease. The Uthraki leader got out of his throne, snarling as he did so. The weaker Uthraki scattered, and left through the large doors leading into the room. Jonathan let them go. His quarrel was with their leader. Void light started to spark around his fists as he walked, moving menacingly forward. He started to pick up his pace until by the time he was near his enemy, he was moving like a blur. Behind him, Edgar sent out bolts of highly concentrated wind, tearing through the Uthraki. Unlike him, Edgar had focused on his mental stats, and with both thresholds passed in intelligence and wisdom, he was far more powerful in the magical realm than Jonathan was. Each bolt was small in size, but contained the energy of an entire tornado. They blasted apart limbs and dented mastercraft armor as they went. Jonathan pushed off and flew towards the guildmaster, who was staring at him in shock. The man fumbled for his dagger, but it was too late. With one apocalyptic punch, Jonathan blasted him into the throne, causing the stone chair to explode in a storm of shards. The Uthraki stumbled to his feet, bleeding violently from a litany of wounds. However, to his credit, he remained silent. He knew that begging for his life would serve no purpose here. With a roar, energy began to flicker around his blade, and he thrust it into his body, eliciting a grunt of pain. Power surged between the weapon and the man, limbing both in a corona of power. The Uthraki opened his eyes, revealing two orbs of red light. He flashed forwards, almost as fast as Jonathan. Jonathan set his feet and grabbed the man's hand out of the air, relying on his martial arts skill to carry him through. With a surge of motion, he twisted the Uthraki through the air, slamming him into the ground. The obsidian exploded upwards, and Jonathan felt bones break as the Uthraki met the Tier 2 obsidian. The man got to his feet a moment later, and twisted out of Jonathan's grasp. His eyes were only growing brighter as the battle went on. Jonathan sighed, and flitted between the man's wild attacks. Whatever technique he was using was not doing much for his battle intelligence. Concerningly, those attacks were growing faster and faster. This battle needed to end quickly. Jonathan summoned his reserves of the void, and coated his fists in thick layers of the elemental energy. With a roar, he blasted his fist forwards, towards his foe. The Uthraki met it with a strike of his own, slaver dripping from his mouth. When the knife and the gauntlet met, there was an explosion of light as the two rival energies fought for dominance. However, Jonathan's eventually won. His fist smashed the dagger out of the way, surging forwards like the herald of the Uthraki's doom. The man tried to get out of the way, but the strike was moving too rapidly. It caught him in the face, and flattened the guildmaster's visage like an industrial press crushing a stick of butter. As the Uthraki flew backwards, his face in ruins, Jonathan flicked his legs, propelling himself forwards. He appeared above the Uthraki, and flipped around in midair, driving his heel into the man's already devastated face. With a crunch, the man's skull broke, finally killing him. Essence surged through the air, and into Jonathan's body, sending him up another level. As the bloodied corpse dropped to the ground, he turned around to see Edgar fighting off a steadily increasing number of guild members. He ran to the man's aid, noting that Edgar barely needed any. A disk of swirling wind floated in front of him, blocking the entrance to the throne room. Behind him, tentacles of air kept the other Uthraki at bay. Every now and again, the shield would erupt with power, and a spike of energy lanced out, blasting through many Uthraki at once. Jonathan simply watched as his companion made short work of the opposition. It was staggering to see how much Edgar had grown, even without the bonuses that Jonathan had. Of course, much of that was to do with the fact that both men had different specialties, but the fact remained that Edgar was impressive against large groups of enemies. He would have faltered against the Uthraki guildmaster, but against the guards, he was flawless. Jonathan decided to simply watch, and intervene if it was necessary. As tornadoes of power swept through the throne room, eviscerating the guards, he sat down, watching with interest. Their revenge had been a lot easier than he had expected. In fact, it had almost been no difficulty at all. Jonathan had not taken a single injury, and Edgar was on track to do the same. Still, the aspect of the fight that mattered, their revenge, was just as sweet. They would have to be more careful in the future though, as many of the Uthraki elders would likely know about their weakness. To get to the peak of Tier 2, they would undoubtedly have to fight some of those supremely powerful fighters, as well as the monsters that made this realm kneel to their power. It would be a mistake to assume that Granath was any less powerful than he would be at the same level. Although he possessed many benefits, his rise to power had been a lot hastier than the worms had been. No doubt Granath had spent his time gathering strength, rather than idly sitting in his city. Although his levels had stagnated, his growth most certainly had not. Jonathan would need to be ready for that. As the last of the guards was obliterated by Edgar's magic, Jonathan stood up. It was time for some hunting. They departed the city, caring little for what would happen now that the city lord was dead. As they strode out through the obsidian gates, the world of Tartarus extended in front of them. Only this time, they were the predators. Jonathan was now faster and stronger than almost all beings at this tier, save for true monsters, or those who had specialized in those stats. As the two men walked out into the world, they both grinned in unison. This would be fun. Rather than heading towards their more familiar hunting grounds, they instead turned towards the center of the world. It was time to see what the fabled interior had to offer in terms of essence. The monsters there were incredibly powerful, and Jonathan was salivating at the thought of testing himself against them. Ancient Uthraki cities that had survived the departure of Granath, filled with beings at the very peak of their tier, ones that had been given millennia to train. It would be a good warm-up for Granath, if nothing else. Jonathan had another 45 levels to go until Tier 3, and it was time to start gathering them. Over the next day, the two men made their way across the world, seeing things more incredible than anything that had witnessed in the ash heaps. Erupting volcanoes that covered entire country-sized areas with lava, their peaks standing dozens of miles in the air. The roof of the world seemed to grow higher and higher the closer one got to the center, and they would likely find that it extended up further than the eye could see once they reached the very center. The fact that this realm was nothing more than the dregs of a world made on a whim of the system did not fill him with confidence about his ultimate fate, but such things were neither here nor there. The system was biding its time, but until then, Jonathan was safe. Instead, he allowed himself to be taken in by the sights. Herds of mountain-sized monsters galloping across the plains, causing the world to shudder in their path. Flying creatures so powerful that they simply flashed across the sky like bolts of lightning. Jonathan was still not at that level yet, but he had plenty of time to reach it. Every sight of a far stronger being simply filled him with more and more resolve to finish his quest. Along the way, they were harassed by powerful monsters, but these were low enough level to not be too much of a problem. The higher level beasts were not interested in the relatively weak duo, simply ignoring them. They would feel Jonathan's wrath eventually, but for now they were safe. As they butchered their way towards the interior, their levels slowly rose. Over that one day, they both gained 2 levels, enough to justify the stops that they had made to fight the monsters along the way. The opportunities for levels were just too easy to not avail of. This trickle of essence slowly grew and grew as they traveled, and by the end of the 5th day, Jonathan was standing at level 161, having gained 6 levels from the journey. With the boosts from his new race, he was gaining free stat points at a rapid rate, and the only thing that remained was to decide on what to do with them. His next stat to cross a threshold naturally would be resilience, which happened to be the one that he wanted anyway. With the trifecta of resilience, strength and dexterity, he would be strong, fast and highly durable. They would also serve to offset each other's downsides. One day, there was a break in the monotony, a strange rock formation that jutted out of the ground in front of them. It looked like an obsidian tower, but it blazed with a magical energy signature beyond anything that Jonathan had ever seen in this realm. It was hundreds of feet in height, and had dozens of floors. Even from here, he could tell that it was heavily enchanted with dark elemental energy, likely to add some sort of spatial expansion to the floors within. Any idea what that might be? Jonathan asked. Beyond the obvious shape, I'm afraid not. Should we check it out? I do not believe that it seems obviously harmful. That would be a good idea. I'll go first then, seeing as I'm the most durable. Jonathan started walking towards the tower, and Edgar cast some of his buff spells. Jonathan felt the power settle onto his shoulders, and he smiled. As he approached the tower, the scent of magic grew thicker and thicker, until he found himself standing in a well of elemental energy near the base of the tower. He took the last few steps and laid a hand on the side. Immediately, he was met with a system notification. You have discovered one of the 3 dungeons of Tartarus. The Tower of Endless Twilight. Drawing upon the power of the conceptual darkness of Tartarus, this dungeon is filled with the twisted forms of many of the common monsters that live in this realm. With the final boss being a near-peak Tier 2 monster, this dungeon is not to be taken lightly. This dungeon manifests itself as a tower of ever-increasing difficulty, with an average level of 175, the same as the realm of Tartarus itself. There are 50 floors. This dungeon may only be entered by a being not native to this realm, and only one dungeon for this realm can be entered. Jonathan withdrew his hand. It looked safe enough. He signaled for Edgar to come over, already heading towards the entrance. A large archway stood on the other side of the building, with an ornate design twisting and turning around its form. Strange animals could be seen galloping in a never-ending circle, and lava flows wended their way down the rock. The entrance was about a dozen feet wide, and the interior was filled with darkness. With a glance at Edgar, Jonathan stepped in, shortly followed by the other man. There was a flash of blackness, and then they were standing in the entrance to a massive room, supported by pillars of black rock. It was filled with monsters, in a variety of poses and situations. All of them were grotesquely twisted versions of the common beasts of the realm, and the floor was bathed in shadow, far more than was normally present. However, Jonathan's senses were more than enough to pierce the darkness. Edgar had a little bit more trouble, but the man still had an upgraded race, and he was able to see, albeit a bit less than normal. The area that they were in seemed to be some sort of safe zone, devoid of all monsters. Judging by the size of the cavern, however, they were going to need all the rest they could get. It was easily a dozen miles in width, almost like a miniature dungeon in and of itself. There were many more floors, however. This dungeon was going to take a while. In a world made solely for progression and training, even the dungeons were supercharged. Without any further delay, the two men walked into the dungeon, and out of the safe zone. Immediately, they were beset by a small horde of monsters, each of which was so twisted that it was impossible to tell their original form. They looked somewhat like wolves, if wolves were pitch black and had more than the normal amount of limbs. Instead of worrying about that, Jonathan simply laid into the monsters with his gauntlets. As one of them came leaping for his throat, he sidestepped, and drove a gauntlet into the monster's side. There was a crack, and disgustingly clotted blood exploded outwards, soaking the rock beneath. Even the internal organs of the monster seemed to have been tainted by shadow. As the monster died, folded in half around Jonathan's fist, it continued to snarl rabidly. It was at the lower end of the level spectrum, and the essence that it provided was minimal. Jonathan threw the corpse into the nearest knot of monsters, and then charged in after it, leaping into the air. Sending void light to his fists, he brought them down in a brutal hammer blow, sending his power pulsing through flesh, bone and rock. There was an explosion, and the nearest monster bodies detonated, sending fragments of bone and flesh everywhere. A large crater was left in the ground, slowly filling with blood. Jonathan dodged a strike from a nearby monster, and flipped backwards as one of them charged him from behind. With a grin on his face, he snagged the monster's fur, gagging a little at how matted and corrupted it was, and dragged it with him. As the monster tumbled head over heels into the air, Jonathan leveraged his new dexterity, and was able to pinpoint the best spot to strike in the blink of an eye. A single finger slammed into the monster's ocular ridge, shattering the bone and sending a shockwave through its head that turned its brain to jelly. As Jonathan landed, the corpse flopped to the ground. However, there were dozens of the creatures, low-leveled as they were, and they just kept coming. Jonathan cracked his knuckles, and sent the void to them, also imbuing his gauntlets with divinity. With a roar, he sent his fist screaming through the air, sending out a blast wave of power that tore through the nearest monsters. He had combined his physical strength with his void cannon ability, allowing him to project the force out with the full measure of his strength. The blast hit like a rocket, and the nearest dozen monsters died in an instant, their flesh pulverized by the blow. The others suffered severe injuries, and they tripped over the corpses of their companions, straight into the path of Jonathan's fists. It was time for him to use a skill that he rarely had cause to use, given that it only really worked against beings weaker than him. Fists of the hurricane projected blasts of concentrated air pressure wherever his gauntlet struck, and for the first time, he decided to track what happened. A slight haze formed around his fists every time that he struck, and when he stopped punching, the haze exploded outwards, stunning weaker monsters. The effect was slight, but against monsters like this, he could use it. The rest of the creatures died in short order, dying either to his fists or to Edgar's devastating area of effect skills. There was no clear way out of this floor, meaning that they would have to kill every monster in the place, most likely. "I have a feeling that this will not be so easy later on," Edgar said ominously. "Our strength will eventually be tested to our limits, and whether we are found wanting or not is what will determine our survival." Not sure what to say to a proclamation like that, Jonathan simply nodded, waiting for the small amount of mana that he had used to recharge. A few minutes later, they kept going, Edgar deciding to float in the air above their heads in order to scout out the area. The monsters were not evenly distributed as far as they could tell, instead congregating in groups commensurate with their species. More than half of the monsters in this region were the strange wolf-like beasts, but there were others present too, larger and more powerful ones. It was towards a group of those that the men headed next. The closest ones looked like crustaceans, but like the wolves, they were entirely black. They lounged in a hot spring of some sort, which bubbled every now and again, sending out noxious vapors into the air. All of them were covered in strange growths that looked like some sort of mimicry of barnacles. They had a trio of wicked-looking claws, one of them coming up vertically from the base of the monsters' heads. Rather than having a small head, most of the space was taken up by rows upon rows of teeth, creating a disconcertingly large array of razor-sharp denticles. Their eye stalks were summited by cloudy, oozing orbs that did not seem useful for anything. Jonathan started to gather energy to his fists. These monsters seemed to be a cut above the others. However, there were less of them overall. With a roar, Jonathan propelled himself forwards, towards the largest of the monsters. He raised one fist to the heavens, summoning his elemental energy to it. He landed like a meteor, bringing his fist down in an explosion of purple light. The shell cracked beneath him, revealing pitch-black meat below. A wave of power coursed through the monster, tearing its flesh apart. A keening noise erupted from its toothy maw, and Jonathan smiled. He kept hammering at the monster, and as it tried to grasp at him with its claws, it soon discovered that Jonathan had picked the one spot that its claws could not reach. With his monumental intelligence stat, he was able to calculate things on the fly, and had estimated where the best place to strike would be. A few moments later, the monster was dead, sending much more essence into him than before. Edgar was midair next to him, raining bolts of wine down upon the monsters below. He was out of their reach, and was able to pick them off one by one. With his massive mana pool he could remain levitating for hours if necessary. He was growing ever closer to his dream of true flight. Ignoring his companion, Jonathan leapt to the next monster, trusting Edgar to not hit him with his attacks. They probably would do little to him, but it was better to be smart about it. Each strike of his fists, driven by all of his prodigious strength, landed like cannonballs, and he left a trail of devastation in his wake. On this floor of the dungeon, he was like a god. There had been about 20 monsters at the beginning of the battle, but their numbers had dropped by over half in less than a minute. Jonathan leaped from monster to monster, using the bodies of the dead as platforms to jump from. By the end of the fight, the hot spring was cloudy with blood, and had it not already been so filthy, it would have been defiled by the fight. As the last bits of essence trickled in, Jonathan sighed. He was still without a level to show for his troubles. At this rate, it would take thousands of these monsters to give him even a single level. However, that was what the later floors were for. Over the next few hours, the men fought their way through hordes of beasts, circumnavigating the cavern with ease. A constant trail of monsters followed them, providing easy pickings for the two hunters. Because of their ridiculous level of strength for this floor, it was cleared up in record time, literally in fact. Upon killing the last monster, they were met with 2 notifications. Congratulations on being the fastest group to clear the first floor for the first time. Below that was a more important one. Do you wish to exit the dungeon? Doing so will force you to reset to floor 1 upon re-entry. Y/N. Jonathan and Edgar quickly picked no, and they were transported to the next floor. It looked much the same as the previous one, except there were higher-leveled monsters. In addition, a cave system ringed the floor, with entrances every few hundred feet. No doubt there were monsters in there to kill as well. At the center of the floor, a group of 3 massive creatures stood, guarding a small chest. They looked like smaller versions of the golems that patrolled the volcanic plains, except these ones were made out of a strange black substance rather than out of rock and lava. They were at least 50 feet tall, and seemed at odds with the relative strength of the rest of the floor. Perhaps they were some sort of challenge mini-boss set or something of the like. The chest seemed quite random. However, to get to them, they would have to kill the rest of the monsters first, a task that the 2 men got to with aplomb. Jonathan headed towards the nearest group, a small flock of human-sized bats hanging upside down within a small outcropping of rock. The floor was filled with strange rocky protuberances, shaped too randomly to be called hills. Many of them extended upwards for dozens of feet, and monsters sheltered within them, or on top of them. Within this particular one, a lip of rock extended out into the air, revealing a colony of monsters. Jonathan started to gather the void to his hands, and signaled for Edgar to flush the beasts out. With a snap of his fingers, the wind mage sent a powerful gust sweeping up through the air, waking the bats from their slumber. With screeches of rage, they swooped down towards their tormentors, bearing massive, fang-filled maws. Jonathan drew back his fist and struck as the nearest bat came screeching for his face, flattening the monster midair. It crumpled around his fist, and its corpse was shot back up, straight into the flying forms of its brethren. They scattered, but Edgar began to cast a net of wind around the beasts. They could not afford for them to get loose and signal the other monsters to their presence. As the bats flapped wildly, trying to escape, Jonathan began to charge up his void cannon skill. At this point it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The monsters were constrained by the net of wind, and were mostly helpless against the onslaught of purple projectiles. Each time a void cannon struck, there was a detonation of purple energy, and a dozen or more bats were turned into ash. Essence streamed down steadily to the 2 men, but like before, it was too weak to do much. As Jonathan barraged the monsters, Edgar slowly tightened in the net, preventing them from escaping. 5 minutes later, the last bat had died, and Edgar released his net. A rain of ash and body parts fell from the sky, landing in front of Jonathan and Edgar. Wrinkling his nose, Jonathan stepped back as the dust cloud rolled out. "Those were some of the most disgusting monsters I've ever seen," Edgar said as he did the same. "Whatever this dungeon is, it needs to be stopped." Jonathan nodded in response, still walking away from the ever-growing dust cloud. About an hour later, 5 more flocks of bats had met their end, and the men were moving on to the inner circle of monsters. The next species on their hit list were a collection of lizards that seemed to be made almost entirely out of rotting flesh. There was no feasible way for that to be possible, unless the beasts were undead. However, a quick scan from Jonathan had revealed that they were living creatures. The sight became far worse as a result. Each of the monsters was about twice the length of Jonathan, and about 3 feet tall at the shoulders. Their mouths were lined with thin, needle-like fangs, each of which dripped with black venom. Jonathan watched from afar as the monsters warred among themselves, slashing around with their long claws, and taking great bites out of one another. Because of their cadaverous state, their bodies simply fell apart when they were touched. However, none of them died from their injuries, and the flesh slowly regrew over time. Besides that, the monsters were not especially tough or strong, and just seemed to be normal examples of their species. "I take it back," Edgar said as he watched. "These are the most disgusting monsters that I've seen." "I think I have to agree with you on that one," Jonathan said, grimacing as 2 large lizards skinned another one, tearing off great chunks of putrescent flesh. "I hardly want to fight them." However, they had little choice. Jonathan decided to break out one of his little-used skills, creating a long blade of purple energy on the end of his hand. For this battle, the further away he could stay, the better. Edgar buffed Jonathan with one of his skills, and gave him a small boost in the form of a friendly gust. Jonathan rode the wind, and leaped into the air, landing in front of the monsters. Immediately, their infighting stopped, and they turned to him, their eyes completely devoid of life. It was like looking at a corpse. A moment later, they charged in eerie unison, their feet making a rhythmic pattering noise on the cavern floor. Jonathan stepped back and then swung, beheading one of the creatures with ease. As the head fell to the ground, the monster's body kept moving, and a tiny nub of flesh started to grow out of the neck. Jonathan swore, and summoned the void to his other hand, remembering the myth of Hercules. He reached out and sent a flare of void light towards the monster's neck stump. The tiny nub of growing flesh burned away, and the monster fell to the ground, dead. Just as the Greek hero had used fire to cauterize the regrowing heads of the Hydra, Jonathan would use the void against these beasts. Edgar caught on quickly, and sent blades of wind towards the monsters, cutting their heads off rapidly. Jonathan banished the mana saber, and instead brought loosely controlled void energy to his fists, using it like fire. Every time a head fell to the ground, Jonathan was there, ready to burn the stump into oblivion. More than a few strikes got through to him, given how close he was getting, but they simply slipped off his armor, leaving disgusting trails of slime. As he worked his way through the tide of living corpses, he slowly sank into a rhythm, able to ignore the grotesque task that was before him. By the time the battle had ended, he was covered in filth from the beasts, but they were still dead. More essence entered him, finally enough to gain a level. Those lizards had not been especially strong, but their regeneration abilities would have rendered a normal fight almost impossible without a mage. Jonathan stumbled back, trying to get away from the pile of rotting corpses. The smell still lingered on his armor, and he found Edgar backing away as he approached. Stopping, he raised his hands in a begging gesture. Edgar shook his head in amazement at the muck covering Jonathan, before summoning a gust of wind. With the wind, he blew the viscera off of Jonathan's armor, finally rendering him clean. However, he still felt dirty. As he left the small pile of gore behind him, he sighed, taking a quick look at his stat sheet. It had been some time since he had last done so. Jonathan Harlow. Tier 2. Void Human, Potent. Divinity Aspect, Void Hegemon. Elemental Mastery, 10%. Elemental Juggernaut, Tier 2 Legendary. Level 162. 72 free points. Strength. 1285. Dexterity. 1041. Constitution. 676. Resilience. 752. Intelligence. 712. Wisdom. 705. Divinity. 10. Health, 10140/10140. Stamina, 28913/28913. Mana, 10680/10680. Titles. True Unbound Spirit, Unique. Nascent God, Transcendent. Forceful Initiate, Mythical. Hasty Initiate, Mythical. Lesser Xenocide, Legendary. Greater Giant Slayer, Legendary. Iron Will, Epic. Leader of Men, Epic. Refined Form, Epic. Avenger, Epic. Lineage Hunter, Rare. Righteous Killer, Rare. Skills. Hungering Decay, Mythical. Greater Smite, Mythical. Rune Savant, Legendary. Void Drill, Legendary. Void Cannon, Legendary. Stamina Redirection, Legendary. Channeled Basic True Sight, Legendary. Sense the Weave, Legendary. Warrior's Trance, Epic. Fists of the Hurricane, epic. Battle focus, rare. Impact, rare. Focused scry, rare. Runes of power, rare. Redirect, uncommon. Pathway skills. Mana manipulation, Journeyman 2. Runecrafting, Journeyman 2. Martial arts, Journeyman 2. True sight, Journeyman 2. Martial path. Flowing hurricane, Journeyman 2. Quests. The strongest. Hellbreaker, impossible. Complete vengeance, SSS. His stat sheet looked to be in order, and he enjoyed gazing upon the list of his achievements. It was a tangible indication of how far he had come. Many of his stats were starting to approach the second threshold, and the number of free points that he had was rising. He gained 9 per level, which meant that by the end of the tier, he would easily have passed all of his thresholds. For now, however, he saved them. For this dungeon, he hardly needed them. He closed the sheet, and looked over at Edgar. "I hope there aren't more of those monsters here," Jonathan said, knowing that there almost certainly would be. "At least we drastically outlevel them. Reminds me of this hunting trip that my father took me on one day." Normally Jonathan would have been too focused on their task to engage in idle chatter, but he needed something to distract him. When I was but a young prince, about 16 years old, my father decided to show me the dangers of hunting monsters. Remember, this was the man who forced me to execute a criminal when I was even younger. Jonathan started walking, and Edgar hurried to catch up. Anyway, he left me in the middle of nowhere, near a nest of massive ants. They scoured the land for any food sources, and they were far stronger than me. My father rode off, leaving me there, to what I assumed was my death. "Your father sounds like an asshole," Jonathan said. "Sorry if that's a bit harsh." "No, I've called him worse things in the past. However, that is neither here nor there. When I was out there, waiting for what I assumed was my death, I cursed my father, and everyone else that I could think of. The ants came some time later, attracted by my noise. As they scurried towards me, faster than I could track, one of my father's guards came hurtling across the land, his sword ablaze. He destroyed the ants in the blink of an eye. That reminded me that no matter how terrifying a monster is, strength is always more important. I would rather face 1,000 of the most grotesque monsters in existence, than the most beautiful one imaginable, if those grotesque ones were below my level." Jonathan could appreciate the sentiment, and he simply nodded. By that time, they were approaching another nest of the lizards, which were quickly dealt with. Using Edgar's wind to blast the filth off him felt just as unsatisfactory as before. However, there was little that could be done about it. Instead, Jonathan consoled himself by blasting apart the corpses with his void cannon skill. As the monsters were reduced to ashes, he finally smiled. Leaving the blasted corpses behind, he moved on. He and Edgar butchered their way across the cavern with ease, not taking any wounds at all. It would become harder and harder as they ascended the tower, but it was still incredibly easy as of now. By the time they reached that level, their own levels would match it.